This program was recorded on Monday, April the 15th, in the year of our Lord 2019. The opinions expressed by the participants in the following program do not necessarily represent that of this station or its management.
Or anybody else.
From the John DeVita Recording Studio, located in an undisclosed and clandestine location on the great northwest side of our fair city of Chicago, we once again are pleased to be presenting yet another edition of our monthly roundtable panel discussion show, Meet the Chicago Historians. Now here's the guy who started it all, John DeVita.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Rich, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another broadcast of Meet the Chicago Historians on the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network on Monday, April the 15th, Income Tax Day, the year 2019. Today, the panel will be talking about several different items: the Titanic, radio broadcasting, and, of course, baseball. So sit back and enjoy Meet the Chicago Historians. And now to start today's broadcast, there's our announcer, Mr. Richard Lang.
Now here's today's panel moderator, John S. Kachelko. John?
Thank you very much, Rich. Thank you, John. Thank you all. It's good to be back with you for the April 2019 edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. We're here, well secured in our undisclosed location, the John DeVita Broadcast Center, one of the true important sites in the Midwest. The snow we had over the weekend obscured some of the checkpoints. It took a little more time to get down here today because all of the checkpoints that you have to go through. We warn people, don't try to find the John DeVita Broadcast Center. It's too highly secured and well camouflaged. But we're down here now, and we'll be with you for the next 2.5 hours, discussing news and events. So before we begin, let's have a few words of introduction. We have there are three of us here today, not counting our impresario, John DeVita, the master of the John DeVita Broadcast Center, and the formerly prominently affiliated with the old radio station WJJG, station manager there. But let me turn to our announcer and let him introduce himself formally and officially to you, Rich.
Yes, I'm your announcer, Rich Lang. I've got a background in history, teaching and learning. For several years, I was a student of the great Ken Little, a name we continue to honor at this presentation, and I taught modern American European history several years ago. So I've got an avocation and a hobby of American and local history.
Thank you very much, Rich, our stalwart announcer and the longest-serving member of our panel. I'll ask him if he would say a few words of introduction.
Oh, I would love to, and you made a mistake there, John. There's four of us here. We're introduced. Well, no, that's right. That's five of us. We have. We're pleasured to have Kate,
our mascot.
And Kate is a regular, and as long as we have something for her to eat and drink, why she's fine with
Kate,
us.
anytime you want to add or say something, just bark right in.
She seems very placid. She's listening to the conversation and thinking of what she can add.
But I'm her broker. and her agent, right? Kate has probably sent more illegal people back over the border than anybody else because she is a registered drug sniffer.
Oh yeah,
and she does a great job. But like her owner here, she's getting a little old too. But I'm Bill Kugelman. I spent 46 years on the Chicago Fire Department. Was also president of the union, Local 2, the Firefighters Union for a while. And retired as chief of the 10th Battalion, and am one of the senior people here. We used to do the Cop Talk show back when we had Bill Giaconetti and who else? Vic Castino, and we had Tony Emilio, and we're missing today. We're missing two of our police people, Tommy McKenna, retired Chicago Police, and also Dennis Fitzgerald, who's the retired Chicago Police, but is also the Grand Knight of the St. Michael's Police Knights of Columbus Council. So it's been a long day and full of anxiety today. I agree, John, that snow yesterday was something that who would have ever expected. We should have had April showers. Well, the showers were a little white.
More like an April blizzard.
Yes, and I naturally try to stay off the roads on those days because we can, we're born and raised here, and we can handle it. But there's so many people that can't handle it.
Yeah. When you hear of all the spin-outs, even, some local drivers are just not adjusting their speed.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah. And we had a couple of real nice days there for a while, and then all of a sudden to get hit by that, and it was white. So, I don't know, our topic, it's right today, is I'm just looking it up here. One of our guests that we have had, Jim Gibbons, is not with us today because he's doing a presentation at 1:00. I'll have to look it up to see where it was. But anyway, it was out in the suburbs somewhere, and his presentation was the sinking of the Titanic on this day. So we can do that, and like you say, today's tax day. I don't know about anybody else, but I had to get a 60-day extension, whatever it is. The tax guy told me, and we'll see what happens now with this new tax system that they've got.
And I want to assure everyone the long-range forecast is that there will be no snow for the 4th of July.
There you go.
So
and
they're fairly. And nothing is certain in Chicago, but they're fairly sure that we will not have snow on the 4th of July. So at least we have something to look forward to.
Don't make a bet on that. Don't go to Vegas.
No.
Maybe snow-free on Labor Day too.
We're at the midpoint of April today, and there is snow on the ground, and it's it's in it. But as I've said, I can recall instances in the past walking home from church on Easter Sunday with snow on the ground.
Yeah.
So it is not unheard of, and not just in March, but even when we had Easter in April. So. It is certainly something that we can have.
I also often think of a lot of sleet on Easter Sunday.
Sure.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But that's one of the good things of living in the Midwest and living in northern Illinois, the Chicago area, is you do get a change of seasons. I would not want to live somewhere where it was 70 degrees all year round, or 70 degrees on Christmas Day, and 120 on the 4th of July. So. That's one of the blessings of living here is that you do get to see fall and summer and spring and winter. And sometimes the winter hangs around a bit too long, but there is a line that says in the Chicago area we have 2 seasons, winter and August. So, and we're being joined by another member of our panel, so we'll give that panelist an opportunity to be seated. But as you say, this is tax day, and it's also the anniversary of the sinking of the RMS Titanic, the Royal Mail Ship Titanic. That's what RMS stands for. It did carry the mails, and it sank on this date at about 2:20 in the morning in 1912. We celebrated the 100th anniversary just a few years ago. Celebrate maybe is... Some would find that inappropriate. We marked the 100th anniversary. It was one of the great tragedies of all time, the great maritime disaster. Over 1,500 people died. About 705 were rescued in the lifeboats. And of course, everyone knows that they struck an iceberg at about 11:40 at night. And the tale is told that the lookout up in what they may have still called the crow's nest was iceberg dead ahead. And that's perhaps the great tragedy, is that they spotted the iceberg at the worst possible time, because what happened was they immediately sent word down to the engine room, and they made the critical mistake. They gave all power astern and hard a port to miss the berg. So they turned right and reversed engines. And the problem with that was, if they had not seen the iceberg at all, if they had smashed right into it head on, the ship would have probably survived. It would have damaged the bow of the ship. If that idiot DiCaprio was out there with his arms spread apart, he would have gotten it. But some would have died. Anyone who had the misfortune of being at the very front of the ship at the bow would have died or been seriously injured. People would have been tumbling out of their bunks, and there would have been injuries. But the ship would have survived, because the damage would have been only to that location at the bow of the ship, and it was designed to take that type of a problem. If when they turned they had kept the power going ahead, if they hadn't reversed engines, if they had kept full speed ahead, they might well have turned sharp enough to avoid the iceberg completely. But the combination of turning and reversing engines doomed them, because it meant that they didn't miss the iceberg. They smashed into the iceberg below the waterline. If you had read stories about the iceberg maybe 30, 40 years ago, they always talked about the 300-yard gash that was cut in the bottom of the ship. Well, there was no 300. If the Titanic had been slashed open like a can opener with a 300-yard gash, it would have sunk instantaneously, the amount of water. What happened was that it sort of bumped and banged against this iceberg, and it popped out rivets here and dented a plate there and punched a hole here and punched another hole. And the result was that there was damage along many sections of the Titanic. The Titanic was designed in compartments so that they could seal the compartments and keep the flooding in just that section. The problem was that they hit the iceberg in so many places that it flooded too many compartments. There was simply too much damage done, too much water coming in. And the captain was informed, Captain White was informed that as each compartment would flood, the water would tip over and flood into the next compartment, because the bulkheads did not go all the way to the deck of the ship. These watertight compartments only went so far, and above that the water would be able to pour into the next compartment. And so that's why the Titanic went nose down. You've always seen the movies of the Titanic being lifted from the stern of the ship, raising up into the water, and then sliding into the ocean. We now know that it broke apart, that it actually broke into several sections. It did not go down intact. Many years ago, there was a fictional book called Raise the Titanic by an author named Clive Cussler, in which divers went down to the Titanic and it was still there in one piece, and they put flotation devices on it and brought it up to the surface. And there was a motion picture made. It was an inspiring idea, but unfortunately impossible, because as we now know from the discovery of the Titanic, that it broke into several sections, and there are two large sections and then debris in between. They call it the debris field. And of course, divers and various devices have gone down. They've retrieved all sorts of artifacts from the Titanic, and they do displays at museums and so forth. Some years back, they had a big display at the Museum of Science and Industry of artifacts from the Titanic. In fact, I picked up I have in my library, I've got a reproduction of the White Star flag, because they sailed for the White Star Lines. The two British competing shipping lines were Cunard, which was the line that in later years gave us the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, and now they have the Queen Victoria and a new Queen Mary and a new Queen Elizabeth. And the other was the White Star Line. And their ships all ended in the letters IC, which is why you get Titanic. It had two sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. So all of the White Star Line ships ended in the letters IC. The Cunard ships always ended in IA. The Lusitania was a Cunard ship, and they had the Mauritania. And all of their ships ended in the letters IA until they were building, in the 1930s, they were building what would be the biggest luxury liner ever built. And they were going to name it the Queen Victoria, which would have kept the IA intact. And King George V was brought to see the plans and the models and the designs for the ship. And someone said, Your Majesty, we are going to name this vessel after England's greatest queen. And King George says, oh, that's wonderful. My wife will be so pleased. His wife's name was Mary.
Right.
And when the king said that, that ended the idea of naming it the Queen Victoria, and that's how we got the famous Queen Mary of the 1930s that carried troops during World War II.
Could have been Maria.
Yeah, they could have, but no, her name was Mary, so it became the Queen, and then that broke it. So then they had the Queen Elizabeth after that, and the QE2. We all remember the QE2, which has now also been retired. And now they have a new Queen Elizabeth, and a new Queen Mary, and a Queen Victoria.
And a Titanic 2 coming.
They've been talking about that for years, but I've never.
It's supposed to be within a year or two.
I mean, I've been reading stories about a Titanic, but I never actually see that it's been launched or that it's actually sailing. But they've been talking about it for many years.
I wonder if the people that own that line, the Whites, got together with the engineers and the designers of the Titanic and said, hey, fellas, come on, let's have a meeting. You were wrong.
Well, the interesting thing is, of course, we think of the Titanic as a British ship. It was a British ship. It was built in Northern Ireland near Belfast. But it was owned by a conglomerate called International Mercantile Marine, IMM. The White Star Lines had been bought out by International Mercantile Marine, and International Mercantile Marine was owned by J. Pierpont Morgan, the American financier. So the White Star Line was actually owned by an American. And if you see sometimes they will show the menus and documents from the Titanic. On those documents, they would have the British Union flag and the Stars and Stripes together, because it was sort of it was a both British and in a sense an American ship as well. It was owned by an American, and of course there were so many Americans on board. Many of the most famous people who died aboard the Titanic were Americans, and I don't know. I've talked to I've give an opportunity for other people who want to jump in and say anything about the Titanic.
Well, let me just jump in. I remember seeing the exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry a number of years ago, and other than the beautiful artifacts, the remnants of what they had salvaged from the Titanic, the thing that struck in my mind most was that they were playing a recording of the ship's engines, how loud they were. If you were in the lower class accommodations like steerage, quite a ways below the main deck, the thumping, boom, 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 boom. This was going on all night. How these people could sleep and adjust to that.
The interesting thing about the Titanic, too, is it was a luxury ship in all three classes. They had first class, which you might say is sort of the upper class, the aristocracy. They had second class, which would be sort of the middle class accommodations. And they had third class, which in the past had been called steerage, but they didn't use that term steerage, because that had a bad connotation, so they called it third class. But even the accommodations in third class on the Titanic were better than on any other ship, and some said they were as good as second class on any other vessel that was plying the North Atlantic. So the accommodations were for the time were rather good, even for the people that were in third. And what had been steerage and then became third class is what we now call tourist class. So it's still third class, it's still steerage, it's just that they don't call it that anymore. They give it a more highfalutin title.
But
Go ahead.
I heard that when it pulled into New York, the first class and maybe the second class didn't go through Ellis Island. They were just let off on the docks. And the third class went to Ellis Island because supposedly they didn't have $100 in their pocket.
Well, most immigrants would have. Most people who were coming to the States as immigrants would have come third class. They could just
Right.
barely. They were lucky to scrape up enough money to buy a ticket
Right.
and come. But another thing is that there were a number. There were German liners. There was a North German Lloyd was the big German liner on the north, and they were making a great deal of money carrying immigrants to the United States. That was really because there was such a flow. We think of all the millions of immigrants that came to the United States in the 1890s and the beginning. Well, they couldn't come by plane in those days. They came by ship. And so think of how many ships you had to haul those millions of immigrants across the North Atlantic, and how much money they were making by accommodating them.
Wasn't there a German ship that turned over in New York Harbor? What was that ship? They put so much water in it, it flipped over. And it was there for quite a while.
I don't know that story. It could well have happened. I don't know that story. The stories I like to tell about the Titanic are the thing about it hit the iceberg at 11:40 at night, and it didn't sink until 2:20. So it took a long time for the Titanic, and that's why so many things were able to take place that give us the stories, that give us the romance of the Titanic. It's why they make movies. Nobody makes movies about the Lusitania, which was sunk just 3 years later in May of 1915. It was sunk by a torpedo, and it went down in a matter of minutes. There wasn't time for all these stories to unfold. It was hit, it sank, and that was the end of it. So I don't know that anyone's ever made a movie about the Lusitania, because there really isn't. There's nothing much that you could show other than it being hit and going down. But a couple of my favorite stories about the Titanic, of course, are John Jacob Astor, who was one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was you might think of him as, in a way, a kind of a Donald Trump figure, in that he owned real estate. He was a New York real estate owner. He owned all sorts of expensive properties in New York City. And he was a very interesting man. He was an amateur scientist. He had volunteered for service in the war with Spain, just as Theodore Roosevelt had. There are pictures of him in his uniform, because he raised a regiment, much as Teddy Roosevelt did. And he was interested in science. He was constantly reading books. His wife was disgusted with him because she wanted to go out to all the New York Society events, and he'd be at home in his library reading a book or working on some scientific, and that broke up their marriage. So he was divorced, and of course, divorce in 1912 was a stigma. He was being cut. He was one of the richest men on earth, but society was shunning Astor because he had taken up with a young lady who was considerably younger than he was, and they were coming back from Europe. Astor and his wife didn't get on board in Southampton in England. The ship picked up passengers in France. They made a stop at Cherbourg before they began across the Atlantic. And Astor and his wife, and I think the unsinkable Molly Brown, she came on board at Cherbourg as well.
So much for that.
She got on board at Cherbourg, and when it hit the iceberg, and of course the word is going out, for everybody to go to the lifeboats. So they put on their life jackets, and when they come to the lifeboat, Mr. and Mrs. Astor, one of the young officers says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Astor, it's women and children only." Now, Astor is maybe the third richest man in the world. Does Astor say, "Hey, buddy, do you know who I am?"
Okay.
Or does he reach into his wallet and pull out $1,000 bill? No, he doesn't do any of it. He says, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know," and he steps back onto the ship. And the last that anyone sees of John Jacob Astor, there were survivors. He was standing as the ship was going down. His hand along the flagpole. He was standing with his arm outstretched, bracing himself against the flagpole at the bow of the ship. And sometimes when you see movies about the Titanic, if you look closely, you'll spot him standing there in his evening clothes with his arm propped against the flagpole. He died John Jacob Astor died aboard the Titanic. Mr. and Mrs. Strauss were the owners of R.H. Macy's. There hasn't been a Macy owning Macy's for a long time. And the Strauss family purchased Macy's, and when they were getting into the lifeboats, again, it's the women and children only, and Mr. and Mrs. Strauss are together. And Mr. Strauss asks his wife to get aboard the lifeboat, and she refuses. And he says, "You must." And she says to the officer, she says, "Mr. Strauss and I have been married for many years. I will not desert him now." And both of them went back onto the ship, and both perished aboard the Titanic. So it's I mean, there's these incredible stories about the dignity of these people. I always say the upper class behaved like the upper class. They behaved with dignity and grace aboard the Titanic.
Sure did, yeah.
How deep was the Titanic, and how deep of water did it go down?
Well, it's the North Atlantic. I mean, I'm not an expert. I
Because
mean,
you were saying they sent divers down to get.
Well, now with
Was it-
I didn't mean literally divers. They go down with these, like mini submarines.
Yeah,
these
but
diving.
Then they didn't. They
And then they
tried-
have arms
Right.
and things. No, I mean it is
Yeah,
too deep. You cannot go
too
down.
much pressure.
You can't skin dive.
that's what I
or-
thought.
Or even, I don't believe you can even go down in these. You used to see in these. I don't even know if
Bells.
they use them. These diving suits where the man would
Right.
be. It's much too deep for that. When I said divers, what I mean is they've gone with these submersibles.
Okay.
These
I
submersibles.
thought maybe right after it sunk, they sent divers.
No,
because
no,
it
it's
would
much
be
no.
too far down.
It's in the
there would be
it's
too much pressure
no.
on them.
It's off. They were approaching the United States, approaching Canada. They were off the coast of Canada, and they were off the coast of Newfoundland where they went down. And another story: the man who was the architect of the ship, he was on board, and the last anyone sees of him, he has his arms folded. He's looking up on. There's a mantle there, a fireplace, and above it is a painting, "The Arrival in the New World," and it shows these ships arriving in New York Harbor. And he had his arms folded, and he's looking up at that painting.
Shaking his-
Again, that's the last that anyone
Right.
saw of him.
John, do you know if it's true that a number of lifeboats were lowered without being at full capacity?
That's true.
And who made that decision?
That's true because at first, people didn't want to get on board the lifeboats. And what I always, it goes against common sense. You think, my God, the ship's sinking. But you see, at the beginning, there wasn't any sense
There was it-
that anything had happened. They had heard some noise. There had been a bumping.
Yeah.
But the ship was still level, or reasonably level. And it's the middle of the night. It's after midnight. You ask someone, do you want to stay on board this big steel ship, which seems to be, unsinkable, or you want to get into this rickety little wooden lifeboat and bob around? Most people, they wanted to stay on board the ship at first.
Sure.
It was only when it became obvious that it was when then the people realized something serious was happening here. By that time, it was too late. Many of these boats were lowered half-empty because no one wanted to get on board. They were refusing to get on board.
Yeah, I bet you a lot of them were unusable because as it came up, they ran out of rope and they were just hanging there. They couldn't get to the water.
They didn't have enough lifeboats for all of the people aboard because they weren't required to.
Right.
Britain had what was called the Board of Trade, which set regulations for shipping, and they had set the regulations. Any ship above 10,000 tons is entitled to so many lifeboats. Those regulations had been issued, I think, in 1900, when 10,000 tons was about top of the line for a ship. The Titanic is many times 10,000
Right.
tons, and it had far more people, but the regulations hadn't been changed. So they actually had more lifeboats than required because they had these so-called collapsibles. They added in addition to the rigid lifeboats, the OIC being lowered by the lanyards, they had collapsibles, which, as they say, they could be cranked up. They had a crank arrangement, and you would crank them up until full size and then pitch them overboard. And they saved about 705 people. So roughly 2/3 of the people aboard the Titanic died. About 1/3
Right.
survived. And interestingly, most of the women, most of the children survived. Most of the men died. The people it was women and children first. Most of those who went down with the Titanic were men.
Right. Didn't the last survivor, it was a little girl, just die about a year or so ago? Maybe longer.
It's more than a year or so ago, I think.
Maybe 5 or 10.
Yeah, it's been a few years,
Right.
but you're right. There was a little girl who was like 3, 4, 5 years
Right.
old at the time of the Titanic, and she survived down into the 1990s, maybe into the new century. She
Right.
was still around, and they would do interviews with her. And when the sister ship of the Titanic was sunk, this would have been the Britannic, I believe. It was sunk in the Mediterranean in World War I. It was torpedoed or hit by a mine. I'm not sure if it was a mine or a torpedo. She was on board that and survived. There was one girl. I'm not sure if it's the same one that lived until the 20th century, until the almost the 21st century. But there was one girl who had been on both ships and survived both. But far fewer people died aboard the Britannic because it had enough lifeboats for everybody on. By that time, after the Titanic, they changed the regulations.
Right.
You had to carry enough lifeboats for everybody on board. So only a very few people died when her sister ship went down.
After that, did they mandate or did anybody build ships with double hulls?
I'm not sure about double hulls. I mean, we make warships. Warships were built with double hulls to avoid the submarine problem.
Right.
I'm not sure about double hulls, but the story is that the Titanic was called unsinkable. Well, the company, White Star Lines, never said that the Titanic was unsinkable. They weren't stupid enough to make a claim like that. But the story is that there was an article was written about it, because this was its maiden voyage, remember? This was the Titanic's maiden voyage. There was a magazine article in which the author of the article said that the Titanic was practically unsinkable.
Okay, this is much better.
Practically unsinkable. That's what created the legend of the unsinkable Titanic. I always tell people, if you're impressed by a ship being practically unsinkable, would you wear a vest that someone said was practically bulletproof?
Right.
You put a policeman. We're giving you a vest that's practically bulletproof. Are we coming up on a
Almost 12:30.
coming up on a break?
Well, good. Now, for a brief intermission. You've been listening to Meet the Chicago Historians.
Hey, I see your fire department.
Hello, friends. Are you looking for a place to have some printing done? Well, I have the right place for you to go, and that is the printing store in Oak Park, Illinois. Call or see Phil Berry at 621 Madison Street, or call 708-383-3638. Phil Berry will sit down with you and help you plan whatever you need printed. Now, his products are brochures, booklets, business cards, catalogs, envelopes, letterheads, flyers, invitations, newsletters, notepads, menus, mailers, manuals, labels, posters, postcards, price list, NCR forms, sale sheets, table tents, pocket folders, and presentation forms. And he also has 1 to 4 color offset printing, digital copying, high-speed copying, graphic designs, typesetting, laminating, foil stamping, die cutting, and imprinting. And his complete bindery service includes booklets, cutting, scoring, folding, numbering, padding, and drilling. So once again, for all your printing needs, call or see Phil Berry at the printing store at 621 Madison Street in Oak Park, Illinois, or call 708-383-3638. They are located at Madison Street and Clarence, just east of Oak Park Avenue. And that's at 621 Madison Street in Oak Park, Illinois. Or give Phil Berry a call at 708-383-3638. For all your printing needs, the printing store is there to help you. They're 621 Madison Street in Oak Park, Illinois. And once again, you can call Phil Berry at 708-383-3638. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to recognize two very important people whose birthdays are within the next week or so. Number one, John Seconda, whose birthday is today, and he's the executive producer of the Windy City Hometown Entertainment. So happy birthday today to John. And this coming Saturday, yep, my pal from WJJG, Big John Shikoka. So happy birthday to John, and they are a big part of the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network. Happy birthday, and God bless both of you.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, this Saturday is my birthday. It falls on Holy Saturday. And when you have a birthday on the date of April the 20th, it happens. I've had my birthday fall on Easter. It's fallen on Good Friday. So this year it's falling on Holy Saturday. But thank you, John. I appreciate the acknowledgement, and wish a happy birthday to John Seconda as well. So thank you all very much.
As a Protestant, what's the significance of Holy Saturday?
Well, it's the Saturday before Easter.
Oh,
It's
okay.
the Saturday between Good Friday and
nothing historic happened.
Well, it's in the sense that Christ was in the tomb. It's the
Right.
day. It's the day that Christ spent in the tomb.
Right.
In the Catholic Church, they have what is called the Easter Triduum, Triduum. Not something they talked about decades ago. It's a more recent. I think it's a more recent emphasis. Begins on the evening of Holy Thursday, and Holy Thursday is so called because that's the anniversary of the Last Supper. It's the night before Christ was crucified. So it is on Holy Thursday that he gathered with his apostles, and they observed the Passover. They were observing the Jewish Passover, and they had the Last Supper, and it's considered to be the institution of the Mass. I mean, in the Catholic faith, that's considered the foundation of the Mass and the foundation of Holy Communion, of the Sacrament of Holy Eucharist, because Christ took the bread and said, "Take and eat, this is
Right.
my body. Take and eat, this is my blood." So Holy Thursday is a major event. So you go from Holy Thursday, Good Friday, the crucifixion, Holy Saturday, Christ lay in the tomb,
Right.
and no masses are celebrated on either Good Friday or Holy. And then, of course, Easter Sunday is the
I
resurrection.
didn't know there was no masses on Good Friday.
The Catholic Church does not, from when they have the Mass on the evening of Holy Thursday, then no Mass is celebrated for the remainder of the night, all day Friday, all day Saturday until the evening when they have the Vigil Mass for Easter. But that's considered a Mass for Easter Sunday. When it's 7 o'clock in the evening, they have the Easter Vigil Mass. But
Not talk about too much.
no Mass is celebrated in the Catholic Church for those 2 days of Friday and Saturday. So
John,
that's
do you know the origin of the term, and it seems rather ironic, Good Friday?
No,
that-
it is.
needs
Yeah, everything
explanation.
else is
Yeah.
holy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's That's an interesting
some
point.
derivate, must be some.
I'm sure there's a reason.
Mhm.
I'm sure there's a reason for it. I mean, perhaps it traced the idea that
So-
Christ, by dying for our sins, he redeemed.
Right.
So
The
it's
overall.
good in the sense. While he
Yeah.
died, he was dying to bring new
That
life.
could be an explanation.
So it
Yeah.
could be in that sense, and it could just be that the word "good" many years ago in Old English or something had a slightly different meaning,
That could be it,
something
too.
like that.
It's a good question
Interesting thing
to
to-
bring up to
To
the
look up, yeah.
priest. Yeah.
Right, because it was the beginning of life,
Hmm.
the dying on the cross, and the resurrection.
Right.
So it was part of the.
So it was.
They don't
it-
call it the trilogy, but I don't know what they call it, if they call it anything.
Like I say, the church calls it the Triduum.
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 Okay.
Triduum. From
Okay.
Holy Thursday
That's a new
to
term.
Easter
Very
Sunday.
new term.
The Easter Triduum. And of course, the Holy Week. This is all considered Holy Week, which
Right.
that begins on Palm Sunday and extends
Right.
until Easter Sunday. And of course, yesterday was a White Palm Sunday. I'll talk a little bit later about Lincoln, but this is also the day that Abraham Lincoln died.
Yes.
Abraham Lincoln died. He was assassinated on the evening of the 14th, I believe, was assassinated on the evening of the 14th and died on the 15th. And that was Good Friday. The Friday that Lincoln was assassinated was Good Friday. And that Easter was called Black Easter
Really?
because the whole nation was in mourning. I mean,
Right.
it was an Easter unlike any Easter that any American had ever known before because the
Right.
whole country was in mourning. We had telegraph. It happened after the invention of the telegraph, so all over the country they knew.
Right.
If that had happened, 40 years earlier, well, it would have taken weeks before the word would have spread out
Right.
west. But with telegraph, everyone knew that the president had been assassinated. So that Easter was known as Black Easter because everyone was in mourning for the death of the president. Well, we're here again, folks. We're in our April edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. We're here at the John DeVita Broadcast Center, and we're talking about the Titanic. This is the anniversary of the sinking of the RMS Titanic. In the year of our Lord, 1912, we marked the 100th anniversary not too many years ago. We've been joined by a new panelist, and he didn't have a chance to introduce himself. So come in and, as John Daly used to say, come in and sign in, please.
Okay. I'm Don Peter. I'm a member and a volunteer for the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago, and I live in Oak Park. That's it.
Very good. And let's have our other panelists acknowledge themselves as well, our announcer.
Once again, your announcer, Rich Lang, with a background in history.
And our anchor man, our long-serving member of the panel,
Is
Bill.
Bill Kugelman, a fourth generation Chicago fireman.
Very good. Chicago's, what do they call it? New York's finest and New York's bravest. The firemen are called
Here, here.
New York's bravest. The police are New York's finest. We're talking about the Titanic. I've been recounting some of the stories. I'd like to tell you my favorite story of the Titanic.
Oh, yeah.
My favorite, sort of my personal hero on board. There are many. There are all these men like Astor and the Strausses. But Ben Guggenheim was about the fourth or fifth richest man in the world. He was in mining and metals. He owned properties and businesses, and he was coming back, and he was informed that there was not enough room for men on board the lifeboats. So they were told to put on warm clothing. Everyone was told to put on warm clothing. Well, Ben Guggenheim has his valet lay out his white tie and tails, his formal wear. He puts on his white tie and tails and heads to the bar. And he's there enjoying, a few last drinks. And the story is that one of the ship's stewards came by and said, "Mr. Guggenheim, why aren't you should put something warm on?" And he shook his head. He said, "Young man, if you make it back to New York City, if you survive all of this, and you may, would you please inform my wife that I died like a gentleman? No woman is going to perish because Ben Guggenheim was a coward."
Well put.
And that's the I have this image of him standing there with his glass in his hand and his white, like Fred Astaire, with white tie and tails. And again, it's just a great story about the heroism of the way they faced these men of incredible wealth, and the way they faced, and their lives are coming to an end, much too young, and they just accepted it.
And I would believe to a certain extent that was the norm.
Yeah. So there are all these great stories. We talk about the unsinkable Titanic. There's another aspect of that and this is apparently a true story, that when one of the passengers was getting on board the Titanic, it is said that a woman asked one of the young officers who was helping people get on board. She said, "Young man, is there any danger on this ship? We're going on the North Atlantic. Could we be in any danger?" And the officer supposedly said, "Don't worry, ma'am. Not even God could sink this ship."
Well, that might have had something to do with it,
So
too.
they always say, talk about tempting
Right,
the Almighty. Not even God could sink this ship.
As they were loading up the lifeboats, were they, I think, to a large degree, separating it by class? First class, second class, third class. Were many on second or third class given a chance to go into the lifeboats?
There were.
Enough in first class refused.
There were more. There were first class people who refused. The reason you have more survivors first and second class is they simply found out about it quicker. The word spread, and obviously you have more. You have more staff. You have more stewards. So the word quickly spread in the first class sections and in the second class sections. It spread more rapidly than it did in third class. But there were survivors across all three classes. There were a greater percentage of survivors from first and second class, but also a large percentage of the crew. I mean, a large number of crew members went down with the ship as well.
Right.
Each ship would have maybe one crewman assigned to it. When you think of how many crew there were aboard the Titanic.
And of course, the captain went down with his ship.
Yeah, and Captain E.J. I said Captain Smith. Captain E.J. Smith. I think I said White earlier.
Right.
Captain E.J. Smith was the captain of the Titanic. He's always portrayed. And there's one story of him with a megaphone, encouraging the men that were working to deal with it, saying, "Be British, boys, be British." And he, of course, went down with the ship. There's a great scene in the movie. There have been, of course, so many movies made about the Titanic. In the 1950s, Hollywood made a movie called Titanic, starring Clifton Webb and Barbara Stanwyck as two wealthy Americans who are returning to the States. And I think Brian Ahern plays the part of Captain Smith.
That's the one I picture as the captain.
And he looks like the real Captain Smith, who had a full beard. And it was Captain Smith's final voyage. He was going to retire. He was given the honor of skippering the Titanic on its maiden voyage as a prestige assignment because he was retiring. He was the senior captain in White Star Lines. He actually had the honorary title of Commodore because he was the senior officer of the White Star Lines, but naturally everyone called him Captain Smith. And the story in the 1953, I think it's 53 film Titanic, the last you see of him is he's looking up at the British flag fluttering from the mast, and he looks up kind of wistfully at it, knowing that he is going to die. All the top officers died. The senior officer who survived was a man named Lightoller, who was played by a great British actor in the British film called A Night to Remember, which was made in 1958.
That sounds right, John.
I'm
drawing a blank in his name. I bet you can pull it out.
And I'm trying to think. He's a great actor, a great English actor. He played Julian Forsythe in the Forsythe saga. I'll think of his name. But I think he was the fourth because they had the captain, and then there was the chief officer, and whose name I believe was Murdoch, and then there was the first officer, second officer, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. And I think Lightoller was the fourth officer, and he was the senior man to survive. And he was blown off. He was when one of the funnels, when they were blowing off the steam, when these engines would shut down, there'd be a gush of steam, and he was blown from the ship into the water because he had not gotten aboard a lifeboat. He was helping people get off. He was helping them get these collapsibles off. He's blown into the water, and he's picked up by one of the collapsibles, I believe. And he becomes kind of the skipper of that lifeboat and gets those people organized, and they pick up even more people than they were able to.
Right.
And so Lightoller was the senior man. A number of the people who died are buried in Canada. There's a cemetery in Canada, I believe in Newfoundland, where they have the graves, of course, the famous orchestra. Everybody knows the story of the orchestra. Which offered to play to keep up the people's spirits as the ship was going down. And I believe that all the musicians died. I think most, if not all, the musicians died aboard the Titanic. And of course the story is that the last thing that anyone heard was, there are always versions of them. Some say they were playing a tune called Autumn. Some say they were playing Nearer, My God, to Thee.
And that's what you often hear.
You always hear that.
Maybe at the very end.
There's a British version of that. It's different from the American version of Nearer, My God, to Thee. In the Clifton Webb film, they play the American version of Nearer, My God, to Thee. In other films, they play the English version. The music, the words may be the same, but the music is slightly different. But there's always this sense you have these people in the lifeboats listening as they hear this music, because you could hear it for miles. It was a clear night. And Debbie Reynolds, of course, was the unsinkable Molly Brown in the movies. And that's a true story. Molly Brown was a rich American heiress from out west. Her husband had made money out west. And she came on board at Cherbourg, and she was a high-profile, I don't want to say, she had a loud voice, let's say that. And she was one of the survivors, and apparently played a role in keeping people to steady, like, hey, we're going to get through this, everybody's, quit crying and let's get this lifeboat organized.
That's right.
So, and because of her survival, she came to be known, she was not just a movie title, she came to be known as the unsinkable Molly Brown.
Now, as far as crews, did they just consider the operating people of the boat, the crew, or everybody who was employed by White Star?
Everybody. I mean, and because of the fact, this was a coal-fired ship, so
Right.
you had lots of crew working
Right,
in the
shifts.
bow of the ship, and staff. I mean, there were so many stewards and waiters
That's
and
what-
maids
that's right,
because
yeah.
it was first class. Another thing, it was the most luxurious ship afloat. White Star Lines emphasized luxury. Cunard emphasized speed. Cunard ships were luxurious. I don't mean to imply that they were banana boats or anything, but White Star was noted for the opulent luxury.
Right.
We've all seen in the movies, they talk about, the dining room, the chandeliers, the china, everything was first class. And one of the stories here about the Titanic is that they were trying to set a speed record. The reason they hit the iceberg was that they were trying to set a speed record. It's not true. There was no way on earth that the Titanic was going to set a speed record because it was too big, and it was fast. Compared to earlier vessels, it was fast, but it wasn't fast enough to set a speed record. The belief is, though, that they were traveling too fast because while they couldn't set a speed record, the hope was that they could get into New York ahead of schedule. That if they piled on a little more steam, they could get in New York ahead of schedule and will get a lot of good publicity. It'll be in all the New York
Right.
papers. Titanic arrives, 6 hours ahead of schedule, and there was some sense that may have been that they were the crew was under pressure to go faster than they should have, not to set a speed record, but to get into New York ahead of schedule.
Okay, during the Second World War, I believe, didn't they use Cunard ships as troop carriers?
sure.
Only because they could outrun submarines?
Oh, sure, yeah. The Queen Mary. I mean, Queen Mary made all those passages across the North Atlantic, and never. I mean, the Germans knew about the Queen Mary, and they would have dearly given anything to sink the Queen Mary because it was such a famous ship. It had been in service before the war. Everybody knew the Queen Mary, but no, I mean, it got through unscathed through the whole war. The great talking about this, the great goat of the Titanic story is a man named J. Bruce Ismay.
Sounds familiar.
J. Bruce Ismay was the managing director of White Star Line. He was the man who actually ran the company, which was owned by J.P. Morgan. He's on board. He goes on board the maiden voyage. And J. Bruce Ismay finds a spot in one of the lifeboats. He didn't dress as a woman. There are stories about men dressing as women. He didn't do that. But he did something that I think most people today might not have condemned him for. The lifeboat was being lowered. There were no more women around, no more children around, and there was an empty space available. He got into it. Again, it's something that another person might do the same thing. You figure, well, there's an open seat there. Nobody else is getting on board.
Right.
But the trouble is, he's the only prominent survivor. And he was just denounced. He became the symbol of evil. J. Bruce Ismay. One of the New York newspapers, when they began publishing lists and they knew who had survived and who had died, one of the New York newspapers did a cartoon with like Mr. History, like the figure of history there, with this big book in front of him, and it says the RMS Titanic, those who perished, and there's Captain E.J. Smith, John Jacob Astor, Ben Guggenheim, Mr. and Mrs. Strauss, the other officers, Major Archibald Butt, who was the personal aide to Theodore Roosevelt. He was like Teddy Roosevelt's personal military advisor, and I think also served President Taft. He went down. All these famous people, and then on the other side it says the survivors, and there's one name, J. Bruce Ismay. There was another cartoon in the New York papers of these people on a New York street, and there's this little guy walking down the street with his hat pulled down over his head and his coat collar pulled up, trying to hide who he is, and all these men are pointing at him, and women are pointing at him, and the little boy asks, like a little boy and his father says, "Daddy, who's that bad man that everybody's pointing at?" And the father says, "That, my boy, is J. Bruce Ismay." It ruined his life. His life was miserable. No one would have anything to do with him. He was cut by society. He was a wealthy man. You know, he never got invited to anybody's dinners or garden parties or anything. And he died. He lived on, I think, until the 1930s, but he was a miserable man for the rest of his life. It's often been said he would have been better off if he'd gone down with the ship, because the life that he saved was a horrible life, and he never outgrew the condemnation that he received for having stepped into that lifeboat, making that snap decision to get aboard the lifeboat.
Whether you ever contemplated suicide, something like this. It could be.
Yeah.
Is that shipyard in? Is it Scott? No, that's
Northern Ireland.
Is that still in operation?
I think. I'm not. The shipping industry is not what it was.
Right.
In
It's
England.
mostly Japan
And I know they do the slipway, the channel where the Titanic was built. That is still there. I remember seeing a documentary where they showed where the Titanic had actually been built. I'm not sure if they still make ships there in that particular, in Belfast in Northern Ireland.
Right.
I'm not even sure if that company survives. They might. That's another thing I have to look up.
You know, you mentioned Cunard, and it dawned on me that when I was shipped overseas, it was by boat. It wasn't by plane like everybody else, but it was a Cunard ship that took us over to France and Germany.
I can't think of the name of the name of the shipbuilder was something like Harland and Root or Harland, and it was two names, Harland and I can't pull out the full name.
The reason I asked, there was a PBS special on and they showed the rampway where it was, and it showed the factory and it was completely empty.
Yeah, and the offices, the building where all the offices were at one time. That's all deserted. It's just,
right.
The building is still there. But
I think they might have archives in there, but that's about all.
That'd be something to see.
You know, these new ships that are out there now, these commercial ships, not commercial, but
Cruise ships?
I don't think you'd call them commercial, but the cruise ships, the size of them is unbelievable. And the problems that they're having with them now, too, they're so damn big that...
The only thing I get, if something goes wrong, there's no place to go other than over the side.
Yeah. I wouldn't say. You see these things, to me, they look like floating file cabinets. I mean, it's just these deck on deck on deck on deck on deck. You look at the Titanic, and it's a beautiful ship. I mean, one of they in addition to the luxury, they wanted these ships to be beautiful in appearance. They wanted them to look. And these things today, I mean, they just look like, I say, like floating file cabinets. And I don't know how many thousands of people they have aboard these ships, if anything were to happen to one of them, And of course, nowadays with helicopters, with there are other, and with a radio. But and again, that points out the Titanic had radio because the Marconi had invented the wireless telegraphy. That's another story. It was the first prominent usage of the signal SOS.
Right.
SOS had just been adopted as the universal signal for distress. Before that, it had been CQD, which some people said meant "come quickly, distress," but that's not true. They just had selected those three letters, but people thought it
would be easy to tap out.
Some people thought it was CQ. CQ meant CQ, SEEK, but the telegraphers were tapping out SOS. So if you had been listening to the wireless that night, you would have heard
Right.
and
Right.
that was what they were tapping on. The two telegraphers kept tapping it out until the engines gave out and they couldn't send electricity. One of the telegraphers survived, one died from the Titanic.
Gee, what does SOS mean?
Save our
Again,
soul.
yeah, they picked it because it's easy. Three dots, 3 dashes, 3 dots. They wanted something
I'm
simple.
kidding, John.
Oh.
I'm
No,
kidding.
but that's
Well,
from
some
what I-
people say it meant save our ship. There were people.
Okay.
There were
Yeah.
people who thought it was picked because it meant save our ship. But
Right.
again, that's just a myth.
But later on, aircraft used it too.
Yeah.
Oh, everybody, yeah.
But that's why airplane pilots have pretty much nautical uniforms, because they're airships at the beginning and not waterships.
Aeroplanes.
Aeroplanes,
yeah.
airships, ships of the air.
One thing the different movies of the Titanic play up to different degrees is the likely negligence of a nearby ship. You know,
Oh,
is this the Carpathia?
it's the
Yeah.
no, the Carpathia. It was the Cunard liner that
Yeah.
that saved the ship.
California?
California.
That's right.
Californian.
There you
I
go.
think it was a Californian. The Carpathia was a Cunard liner that, if my memory is correct, it was about 58 or 60 miles away from the Titanic. And the captain of the Carpathia was a man named Rostron, Captain Rostron. When he got the signal, he immediately told him to turn about, head for the coordinates that they had been given, because in addition to SOS, they're tapping out their locations so that you could find them.
Longitude, latitude.
And he did everything but burn the furniture. I mean, he did everything but he put on every ounce of speed that they could get out of the Carpathia. They arrived, I think the Titanic finally sank at 2:20. They arrived within the next 30 to 45 minutes. They were there close. They got close, but like I say, close but no cigar. It was the Carpathia that picked up the survivors. The people who did survive came aboard the Carpathia. And our friend Bruce Ismay figures in the story again, because when Ismay gets aboard, he's recognized by the officers. And the story is that he says, "I'm Ismay. I want a private room." So he said, "Yes, Mr. Ismay." The captain said, "You can have my quarters." So the captain of the Carpathia gave him his quarters, because after all, he's the owner of the shipping line. And he stayed there throughout he never came out to visit the survivors. He never, you would think that in a position he'd come and try to comfort people.
Sure.
"I'm very sorry, we'll do whatever we can. Our company will do." No, he stayed in his cabin until they arrived in New York. And this just added to the condemnation
Right.
of our friend J. Bruce Ismay. But, go ahead.
Oh, the captain of the Californian, I believe. Titanic was in sight, and he could see the flares, and he said something. Oh, they're just celebrating
Yeah,
on
he's
board.
saying,
or
"Look,
something."
looky them fireworks,"
Yeah.
the-
That's more truth than legend.
That's absolutely true. The Californian was an American ship. They were just a few miles. They were a matter of 5 or 10 miles away from the Titanic. And the Titanic could see the Californian. The Californian could see the Titanic, but he had gone to bed. The captain of the Californian had gone to bed. He's awakened by one of his officers who says, that ship that we saw? Yeah. They're shooting off fireworks. He said, "What color?" "They're white." "Oh, okay. Well, if anything else happens, let me know."
Yeah.
Puts away the horn and goes back to sleep.
One movie covered that nicely, if I
Yeah.
remember.
They,
Gentlemen, it's time for another intermission, and we'll be right back after these messages of interest and importance.
Do you suffer from pain? Do you know someone that has constant pain of their low back, neck, shoulder, knee, or wrist? Have they tried medications, exercise, physical therapy, or chiropractic, and nothing seemed to make it better? Well, I may have your answer. Why not try a napropath? Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Wayne Chickowitz, and I've been practicing 30 years treating pain. I'm board certified and hold a diplomate in pain management. For your convenience, we have 2 locations. In Cicero, 3602 South 61st Avenue, 708-656-7000, or in Villa Park at 122 West St. Charles Road, Suite 1A, 630-833-4007. Why not try a napropath and stop the pain today?
Chicago.
Now, back to our show. John, I was thinking more of the Titanic in the terms of where there are many rescued survivors that had been in the water. We know that the water was very cold in mid-April, North Atlantic. You think many survived being in the water for several hours?
No, the ones that survived were on board the lifeboats because the water was brutally cold. And that's why, you know, even the people that went down and had life jackets, remember, it sank at 220. So anyone that survived the sinking would have been bobbing around, but you couldn't survive in that water for 3/4 of an hour until the ship arrived. It was simply too cold. Hypothermia. I'm not a expert in medicine, but your body simply can't, even bundled up, you simply can't survive in that degree of cold for that length of time.
Did many unloaded lifeboats make a point of trying to pick up?
They did.
Yeah. Okay.
Some did.
Some did.
Some did. Some didn't.
Yeah.
There was one husband and wife, very wealthy, who sort of commandeered one of the lifeboats and wouldn't let the officers, complained that they didn't want the officer going back to pick anybody up. They were ruined as well. Again, when that story came out, their name in society was destroyed. The captain of the Californian that we were talking about, his career was ruined. And you may wonder, well, why were they looking at the fireworks? Because the Titanic is firing off these skyrockets. Why didn't they just respond to the wireless message? Well, because the Californian had shut down their wireless about 15 or 20 minutes before the Titanic began sending out the signals. They had shut down at 11 or 11:15. And their wireless is off. And they didn't have the presence of mind to turn it back on when they saw the fireworks and signal them. There's other aspects of the story. The telegraphers, when they were on their way toward New York, the telegraphers had tons of messages. They were sending messages from the passengers to Cape Race in Newfoundland, which was the wireless station nearest to the sea lanes in the North Atlantic, and they were sending all kinds of telegrams, like, "Honey, I'll be arriving, at noon. Tell my broker to buy 100 shares of ABC Corporation." They had stacks of these communications from the passengers, and one of the ships sent them word about ice. They were sending them additional warnings about the ice, and one of the telegraphers wired back, "Shut up. I have traffic for Cape Race." So the other vessel said, "Okay." The ships that were closer toward arriving in the New World were aware of the fact that there was a real problem. There was a lot of ice in that area, and early April is a time when the North Atlantic, these icebergs are plentiful in that region at that time. So the telegraphers bear some of the blame for this, problem as well, because they were too busy sending all these passenger communications. But it's a fascinating story. There've been many movies made. I've never seen the full DiCaprio movie. I watched about half an hour of it and didn't particularly like it. But the earlier films, A Night to Remember, the English film, and the Clifton Webb film, and the Titanic, and they did a television. Sort of a TV movie with David Jansen playing one of the folks aboard. This was made in the 1970s with David Jansen, and I think George C. Scott plays Captain Smith, if I'm not mistaken.
What was the name of it?
Something like Titanic. There were two TV movies. One was ABC. I think that was the one David Jansen was in. That was called SOS Titanic. SOS Titanic. It's a television movie about it. And then CBS did a movie in which George C. Scott plays the captain, plays Captain Smith of the Titanic.
Must have grown a beard.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Again, he looked appropriate, for the role.
He had glue.
Yeah.
John, this movie you were speaking of earlier, 1958 British movie on the Titanic, I think the star was Kenneth Moore.
Kenneth Moore.
That's just hit me.
Kenneth Moore.
Yeah.
Great.
I think that's one of the best.
Great
One of the
British
best,
actor. It's a very good film. Based on the book. There was a book written, A Night to Remember, and the motion picture version of it is very well done. Very well done. Yeah. Kenneth Moore, great actor. Really great actor. So we're talking about the Titanic. We talked about, of course, we have several commemorations over this weekend. We're talking about history. Today is the day on which Abraham Lincoln died after his wounds that he suffered at Ford's Theater. April the 12th, Friday, I always call it a black day in American history. April the 12th, 1861, the Civil War began. At 4:30 in the morning, the Southern Shore batteries in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, opened fire on Fort Sumter. And everybody learns in school that the Civil War began with the firing on Fort Sumter. That happened on early in the morning, 4:30 a.m., April the 12th, 1861.
Who was the first guy to fire on the Fort Sumter?
There was a southern firebrand who wanted the hated the Union and wanted secession. I just saw a picture of him in a book. I'll think of his name before the program goes off. But he wanted the honor of touching off the first shot on Fort Sumter. And when the South lost, when it became apparent that the South had been defeated, he wrapped himself in a Confederate flag and committed suicide. He couldn't face the idea of living in the United States of America anymore.
So they won the first battle of the Civil War, the South, and they won the last battle of the Civil War.
After the war had actually taken place, after the surrender had actually taken place. Yeah,
right.
They won a skirmish out west.
Right.
The firing on Fort Sumter didn't kill not a single American serviceman was killed in the hours-long bombardment of Fort Sumter. But after they surrendered and they insisted on firing a salute to the flag, one of the cannons exploded, and it killed, I believe, one man and injured two others. So there were Americans that died after the surrender had already taken place. And also on April the 12th, 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died at 3:30 in the afternoon on April the 12th, on the threshold of victory, just weeks away from the surrender of Nazi Germany, May the 7th. FDR died at Warm Springs in Georgia at the age of 63. So I always call it a day of death, the horrible Civil War. They now think that the casualties, American dead, they've upped the total number because records were not all that accurate.
Right.
They now believe that it's something like 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War, where just a few years ago they still thought it was about 600,000. So it is true again that more Americans died in the Civil War than in all of our other wars put together.
Put together.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
They had thought that had been surpassed. They thought that 600,000 figure had been surpassed, but now that they've recalculated the numbers, it's once again true. So just this horrible tragedy of American history, and then the death of FDR both took place on April the 12th.
There's one Twilight Zone episode I admire, maybe not so good in and of itself, but it portrays Lincoln at the very end, and he basically is saying, I am the last casualty of the Civil War.
Yeah,
That's very well done.
Yeah, it's a clever idea. The folks, they're watching this parade of soldiers, and they think they can't understand what it's all about until you realize then the last man coming up the road is Abraham Lincoln. These are all the dead, and the people seeing them are dead. These people that are watching them don't realize that they're dead as well.
And a certain part, and I don't know, but back then, I don't know how they figure casualties, but now they get into this historical revisionists, and you don't know if it's right or if it's wrong.
We have to be careful because when they say casualties, they mean dead, wounded, and missing. People hear casualties, and I think some people automatically think dead. I mean, well, no, casualties are the total number. It includes everybody injured, and it includes everybody who's missing.
Right.
many of the missing are dead. They're just not accounted for.
Right.
Some of them, there are always those that disappear, go over the hill, and are never heard from again. But they now think the total of dead in the Civil War. They now calculate it at 750,000. That's that's not just some curve. So this is
You
what
have to consider
the
the-
government, the
Right.
Army, the Army. I guess they've done research, and some of these numbers in the past were just sort of picked out of a hat because they
Right.
didn't keep that accurate of records.
Right.
So, and of course, dead. The number of men that were wounded and died. The medicine. They hadn't discovered bacteria yet.
No.
They didn't discover bacteria until the 1870s, and the Civil War is in the 1860s. You've all seen stories about the surgeon operating, and then he takes the knife and wipes it on his
Yeah.
dirty apron, and
Yeah.
because all they thought in terms of was dirt. If it looked clean, that was good. They had no conception of
Right.
bacteria, and so many of these guys died of infection from
money.
because
Yeah.
they didn't understand infection.
And
A lot of them died up here in Chicago.
It would be so easy to a certain extent because how much booze was floating around the battlefield. I mean, you could just slosh it around, and that would, if not all of it, it would kill a lot of
Yeah,
it.
yeah, and the discovery was about, I think that the discovery of bacteria, Lister, and that all happens in the 1870s. So it's it's not too many years, but again, close doesn't
right.
count. It was
That's a good point. I bet most of the alcohol on the battlefield was used to give to soldiers to deaden the pain of any
Yeah.
coming up. Maybe ether was a little bit of limited supply, but if they had poured alcohol liberally on the wound,
They didn't have that.
But they wouldn't have thought there was no
they didn't
cause
have
and
that
effect there.
understanding
Yeah.
of the different
Right.
of
That's an
alcohol,
interesting
of
point.
germs. They didn't know about
Right.
germs. They hadn't discovered germs.
Well, look
The
at the way it
alcohol was
is now
everywhere.
with this measles epidemic that's going around. You know, everybody thought that was gone.
It was. Yeah.
They
Well,
those
they
who
said from
refused
somebody from
vaccination.
Israel, some kid from Israel brought it in. I don't know if there's anything to that or not, but
No.
he went to New York and
People
it's,
from not just Israel but all over, they don't believe in inoculation.
there's a lot of people in this country. What do you call it?
They didn't want to. When my son was born in France, and they didn't do anything over there. I had to. Well, it was in an army hospital, but I had to make sure that the baby was inoculated.
Okay. Now, did your son have to become a citizen, or
He was a double citizen
okay?
of the United States
And
and of France.
right,
And when he became of age, he had to
declare
choose
one or the
one.
yeah.
or the other. When he went into when he got called into the Illinois State Police, he had to tell them that just weeks before that, because I told him that I had heard that this was going to happen. They were going to ask him if he was just a citizen of the United States.
Technically, he was.
He went over to. Oh yeah, he was. But he went over to the. What do you call it? The French
French embassy.
embassy and signed the papers over there, rejecting his French
Right.
citizenship.
So among adults,
They-
then, there's
they-
no such thing as maintaining dual citizenship.
Yeah, there is.
Yeah.
Well, sure there is, and a lot of people do that because they can
Tax
travel
benefits.
and get on some cheaper
Yeah.
form of transportation.
And you can get into different countries with an Italian, in my case, with an Italian
Yeah.
passport than you can
Right.
an American one.
That's interesting.
Right.
But I've just got an American one now.
Yeah. Well, when
Because my dad was
Johnny,
born in Italy, and he says he didn't tell you about it, but you had that, so you got the chance now. So I had one for a while, and I said, no, I don't think so.
my some of my relations were born in Canada, and they have kept theirs,
Right.
even though they live in the United States, because they can travel
Like
a lot
right,
with that Canadian.
Right.
When Johnny went down to the state police headquarters, to the state of Illinois building, that he was going to take the job, they did ask him about that, and he said, told him the truth, that he was born over there, blah, blah, blah. I had a dual SIM, but he had just rejected or
So I showed him paperwork.
and the guy says, he says, you were one of those frogs, huh? And the guy, the trooper looked at him, Johnny, says, did you get that from my dad? Because my dad was over there. He used to call me a frog, half frog once in a while.
Boy, some of us seniors who haven't traveled in quite a while now, isn't it true that you need a passport to visit Canada?
I think so.
I think
Or maybe
so.
technically not to visit Canada, but to be admitted back to the United
Come back to the
States.
States,
I think
perhaps.
that's,
I don't know if Canada
something
you
new.
need, yeah.
That's
I
something
think you
new.
need
Maybe
a
Mexico as
passport to
well.
get on an airplane now.
I'm
Not
sorry.
internally, not within the United States. You don't need a passport. If you're
Because they're
traveling from New
coming
York to
out
Los
with a
Angeles, you need a passport.
2020 or 2022 with a
October
different
2000.
ID. So if
Exactly.
you don't have a passport to get on a plane, you can have this card that'll get you on a plane.
But to get that card, you must have a lot of
5 or 6 sources of identification.
identification, and one of them is a passport.
Right.
So,
I see a lot of ads on TV late night about this.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not sure, but I think something when you go through security at an airport, I think maybe I'm wrong, but I understand that you need a passport to get on a plane.
I don't think that. I mean, I'm not. I haven't flown.
I don't know if it's
I don't
gone
think
into
you're-
effect.
If you're going from Chicago to St. Louis, I don't think you need to have a passport. I don't think they require a passport.
I don't know,
You wouldn't think so.
No.
but there's
If you're
this.
going
There's
overseas,
this.
if you're going beyond the boundaries of the U.S., then
There's
yeah,
some,
Then you do.
and I think everybody's going to be required to get that new ID card.
Yes,
It's a federal ID
October
card.
of 2020.
Right.
It'll be coming.
Is it in 20 or 2022?
2020.
2020?
Yeah.
Now, will that double as a driver's license too?
Good question.
Don't. Who knows?
Everything.
It sure looks a lot like a driver's license when you see pictures,
Right.
quick pictures of
You know,
it.
for decades there's been a lot of resistance to the idea of what they call a national identity card. Most European countries, they issue you a national
Right.
ID card,
Okay.
and there's always been tremendous opposition to that in Congress. There's always been senators and congressmen who have not wanted that because they think it's un-American, that an American citizen doesn't need a federal identity card. Your state driver's license is sufficient.
Right.
But
So-
the
But a
reason,
passport
It's
is
coming though.
the
essentially
reason
the
for
same
that
thing.
is that people overseas, in Europe or Asia or wherever, they go from country to country like we go from state to
State to
state.
state.
Mhm.
Well, those are what they call open borders.
Yeah.
But
Well, the EU
there's
would
certain
be-
countries that are starting to rethink that because they're getting so many immigrants.
Yeah, I don't blame them.
Yeah.
I don't want to pay for them.
Send them to what do you call it? Cities, sanctuary cities.
Mm. Well, anybody? We've spent about 3 segments on the Titanic. Does anyone have any further comments about the Titanic? The Royal Mail ship Titanic, which perished with 1,500 souls, as they said at the time, on this date, in the year of our Lord, 1912.
How
White
much-
Star Liner.
How much did it cost to build the Titanic?
I have that information. It's not.
I think I heard on the radio in the money of 1912, 9 million.
and it
And it'd be something like 200 million now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And how long did White Star survive after the Titanic?
White Star survived, but in the Depression, the Depression did in the White Star lines,
Okay.
and White Star merged with Cunard in the 1930s. And for a few years they called it Cunard White Star, but then they dropped the White Star, and the
Cunard's still around though.
Cunard is still around. They scrapped, but the Depression naturally it killed the luxury trade for a while.
Right.
And with when we shut off immigration, the United States pretty much shut down immigration in the 1920s.
Right.
Consequently, you didn't have this flow of immigrants, and that was the big cash cow for many of these shipping firms. So there wasn't as much demand for travel across the North Atlantic, and aircraft then began, not right away, but you were beginning to get air travel. So they began scrapping, combination of the Depression, the end of immigration, the beginning of air travel. They scrapped a number of ships, including what Cunard did was most of the ships they scrapped were the White Star ships.
Okay.
And this ties into our story because there were three sister ships, the Titanic, the Olympic, and the Britannic.
Right.
The Britannic was not completed when the Titanic went down. The Olympic was the first one to be completed. It was already in service. The idea was that these were going to be what were called running mates. We hear the term running mates and we think of candidates running for office, but running mates on the North Atlantic meant you had three ships so that you would continually have ships en route.
Right.
One ship would be leaving New York, one ship would be leaving Southampton, another one would be in between, and you'd have this continuous service. So what became the Britannic had not been launched. It was supposed to be called, I believe, the Gigantic. That was the name that was, because you had Olympic, which means of enormous size. The word Olympic actually means great. We think of it as a name for the sports. But the term Olympic means something great and powerful and big. So they were going to have three ships named Titanic, Gigantic, and Olympic. Well, after the Titanic went down, the public relations aspect of having a ship named something that sounded like Titanic was not a good idea. So they changed it to the Britannic. Okay. The Britannic is sunk by a mine or a torpedo in the Mediterranean during the First World War. This leaves the Olympic. The Olympic remained, and it's a sister ship of the Titanic. It's virtually identical to the Titanic, except for the name. It remained in service all through the 20s. When Cunard and White Star Line merged, it's laid up. And I think in 1938, it was scrapped. If they had kept it for just one more year, when World War II broke out, they wouldn't have scrapped it because they needed every ship they could lay their hand on to carry troops. It would have probably served through the war. And then at the end of the war, when there was already a great deal of interest in the Titanic, I've always speculated they would have kept it. It would still be around. It would still be there. You could go and walk the decks of a ship.
I was going to say it might be just a museum.
It would be a museum today.
Like the
and
QE2.
you could walk the decks of the sister ship of the Titanic, a ship identical to the Titanic, virtually. And they could have then outfitted the ornamentation so that it would have been identical. If they'd only kept that ship for another year and a half, it might still be there.
That's right.
And all these people that are interested in the Titanic, you could actually see an identical copy of the Titanic. But sadly, they scrapped it, I think, in 37 or 38, just on the threshold of World War II. And they're all gone. All three of them are gone.
Was one immediate result of the sinking of the Titanic a mandate that every ship needed to carry lifeboats that would accommodate every passenger?
Had to have enough lifeboats to accommodate everybody on board, passengers and crew, which is why when the Britannic is hit in the Mediterranean, the only people who die are the people who had the bad fortune of being right near the explosion when the ship was struck. Everybody else gets off because they have enough lifeboats on board to accommodate everyone.
And they did it soon enough.
It's hit, and they immediately begin releasing people, and people know enough now. Yeah, we're going to get on that lifeboat right away. The other thing they mandated, I think, was that you had to maintain 24-hour service on your wireless. You couldn't turn off your wireless when you went to bed at 11 o'clock.
Right.
You had to keep the wireless. They also set up a special service in the North Atlantic for icebergs. They set up a special service,
like a watch,
American and Brit, like an iceberg watch, to monitor the icebergs and warn ships of the dangers that pertain to them.
When did they institute, like on these cruise ships? The first thing they do is they introduce a drill, a safety drill, and everybody has to show up to.
They had drill. They were supposed to have drills on the Titanic. I think they kept putting them off. They kept they had life. They had life preservers.
Right.
And they had lifeboats, and they theoretically, but it was considered unnecessary because the Titanic, nothing was going to happen to the Titanic. Oh, and one other thing. Our concept of lifeboats is very different from their concept of lifeboats. We think of a lifeboat as if the ship sinks, You get on board the lifeboat and bob around in the ocean until another ship comes and picks you up. That's what happened to the Titanic. But in those days, lifeboats were looked upon as being like taxis.
Right.
The idea was that if your ship was sinking, there would be another ship close by.
That's right.
That with wireless, there'll be ships, and there's so much traffic in the North Atlantic. So all you need the lifeboat for is to ferry people from the sinking ship to the rescue ship.
Right.
And then it comes back and
Right.
picks up more and take. So there wasn't a sense that you had to have a lifeboat for every passenger,
Right.
because these were just little ferry boats that were
Right.
going to be running you back and forth to the rescue
But
ship.
if there was nobody in sight, then it's a whole different
Titanic
ballgame.
goes down, and you got the Californians sitting there saying, "Look at those pretty fireworks," and not doing anything. And the Carpathia is 58 miles away, and it arrives 45 minutes too late. So,
Isn't it a shame, Don, and I know where you're coming from, that not only this with the Titanic, but anything that was good, that something bad had happened before people thought of ways to.
Well, look at Our Lady of the Angels.
Unless you're a study of
Or
human
how
history.
many how many people have a fire in their building? Well, I'll get out in a little bit. I gotta cook a couple hamburgers before I get out, or something like that.
Yep.
well, the
Yep.
best example of that is Pearl Harbor. You know, we were in the movie Caine Mutiny, the lawyer says, "Our fat, dumb, happy country." We were a happy-go-lucky country on December the 6th, 1941. We didn't think anybody was ever going to touch us.
That's
or bother
right.
us.
Yep.
We learned the hard way at Pearl Harbor, but as a result, we've been much more vigilant. There's never been another military attack on this country like Pearl Harbor since Pearl Harbor. Now, 9/11, but that's different. That was terrorism within.
Right.
But no enemy has ever dared try to launch a Pearl Harbor
That's
against
right.
us ever since, because we're vigilant. We've got radar. We've got every possible surveillance now. We learned our lesson the hard way at Pearl Harbor.
After what was the first battle in the South Pacific? Midway. After that, the Japanese were always on the defense. They were never on the offense again.
No, that was the war. We essentially won the war at the Battle of Midway.
Right.
Mid-42.
But like John said, it takes something bad to happen, and you hit it right with Our Lady of the Angels.
Yeah.
All of the different rules and the regulations that came about because of that.
Right.
Not only in
They had
the
the
state of
Iroquois Theater
Illinois,
fire.
There's another
but
example.
the whole country, the whole world learned from that.
That's right.
And it's just a damn
And
shame that that has
Thank
to
God
happen.
they learned from it.
The concept of what they call the panic bars,
That
wasn't that an outgrowth of the Our Lady of the Angels?
Iroquois
No.
Theater fire.
Yeah.
They
Iroquois
existed before that, but didn't they become mandatory after Our Lady of the Angels?
No.
Oh, it could be one
Could
of
have
the.
been, yeah.
Could be one of
But the
them.
Iroquois
But-
Theater, the doors opened in.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And
Many
it was, and they had stairways changed so the people in the cheap seats couldn't sneak down into the expensive seats.
We had that. There was a big fire. The shirt factory in New York City around
Triangle
19
Shirtwaist.
Yeah.
And the
They-
doors were locked. Doors
Yep.
were bolted shut
Right.
because they didn't want the employees sneaking out during working hours.
It still,
Yeah,
it
in
still
Iroquois,
happens
they built fire
at
escapes.
some of the movie houses that are around, or meeting places,
Right.
where you see locks on the doors.
Right. In the Iroquois Theater, they built fire escapes, but they didn't put any stairs on them.
Yeah.
And some bureaucrat let them open up like that.
One of them there bureaucrats.
Yeah, bureaucrat.
Excuse me, gentlemen, it's time for yet another intermission. We'll be right
Again?
back after these messages of interest and importance.
Intermezzo.
Well, friends, hopefully spring is here. And before we get any heavy rainstorms, you may want to check the roof, siding, and gutters on your home. So be sure the roof, siding, and gutters on your home are in great shape. You don't want mold or mildew in your attic or crawl space, or drip, drip, drip on your ceilings in your rooms, or have your walls damaged by a leaky gutter or bad siding. You don't want double expense. Sooner or later, they have to be taken care of. So call Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters at area code 630-616-1359. Mike Besh will drive over in a shiny red truck with ladders on top, and Mike will look over your roof, siding, and gutters and give you an estimate and go from there. So once again, friends, don't have double expense. Call Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters for a free estimate at area code 630-616-1359. Again, Mike Best will drive over in a shiny red truck with ladders on top and give you an estimate on your roof, siding, and gutters and go from there. Now, don't forget, this is April, and we can have some terrific rainstorms within the next few weeks or the next month or so. So call Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters at area code 630-616-1359 for a free estimate. Best Brothers Roofing, Siding, and Gutters.
Now back to our show.
Well,
Whenever you're ready, John.
Thank you, Rich. Rich Lang, of course. Rich Lang does recreations of old-time radio broadcasts.
And not by myself.
I thought you did all of what.
Oh, yes, and sound effects. Right.
Yeah, he does. So if you ever want someone to get in touch with Rich Lang, if you'd like a recreation of the Jack... Well, now, cut that out. The Jack Benny Show. That silly kid.
Talk about
Dennis
a split personality.
Now cut. So we're here going into our fourth of five segments, our April edition of Meet the Chicago Historians. You ought to say a word about our good friend and our buddy and longtime host of the show, moderator of the show, John, Jack, Red. He got all these nicknames. Red Ryan. And we always say the red does not reflect his political point of view. Longtime stalwart officer of the Chicago Police Department. Jack's been our host for many, many years, and Jack, we wish you the best. He's been a bit under the weather for some time now, but we hope he will be coming along.
Hopefully he'll
day
come
will come
back.
where he can come back
Yeah.
and once again rejoin us as the moderator of Meet the Chicago Historians. So I hope Jack has a very blessed and a happy Easter. Hope all of you have a very blessed and happy Easter. And we've been talking about the Titanic, which went to its watery demise in 1912 on this date. A Night to Remember, a famous book was written called A Night to Remember, made into a motion picture starring Kenneth More. Thank you, Rich, for reminding us of that great British actor. And we talked about April the 12th. April the 13th, which was Saturday, is the birthday of one of our nation's greatest statesmen, greatest presidents, Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson was born on the 13th of April, 1743, and he was 33 years old at the time that he drafted our Declaration of Independence.
Incredibly young.
Birth certificate. These were mainly young men. I mean, John Adams was one of the older fellows. He was 41.
They sure had some forethought, didn't they?
Great men.
And let's hope that the people that we have now have that same forethought.
Yeah.
Adams and Jefferson really didn't get along together, right?
They were friends. They were friends at the time of the Declaration of Independence. They served together. Adams and Jefferson and Franklin were three of the five members of the committee that drafted the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson did the actual work, but they were on the committee that approved it. And they were good friends, where they fell out years later when the Constitution was enacted, and Adams became our country's first vice president under George Washington, and Jefferson became our country's first Secretary of State.
Right.
And they had different views. Adams became what was called a Federalist, and Jefferson became the leader of a party. It came, for want of a better term, to be called the Jeffersonians. Sometimes they were called Republicans. Sometimes they were called Democratic Republicans.
That's right.
You'll see in the history books Democratic Republicans. At the time, they tended to call them Republicans, but really they were the Jeffersonians. And the Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton. These two men, they were like fire and water. Jefferson and Hamilton were bitter enemies. Adams did not like Hamilton either. He made some very disparaging remarks about Alexander Hamilton. But then not many people got along with John Adams. John Adams was a rather, the word irascible could have been created for John Adams. But what happened was they fell out over politics. They became bitter opponents politically in the Washington administration. But then in later years they mellowed, and they became friends again, and they exchanged a correspondence. They never saw each other again. There were long years when they never saw each other. But they wrote back and forth and became close, good friends once again.
Right.
And they both died on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which they had both been instrumental in being adopted. They both died on the 50th anniversary, July 4th, 1826. And the story, of course, is that when Adams died in the evening of that day, he said, "Jefferson still lives," not knowing that Jefferson had died earlier that day. Of course, unlike Lincoln's assassination, there was no telegraph, no wired telegraph in 1826. It was just a few years away. It wasn't that long in the future, but it took time for news to travel. So neither was aware of the fact that the other was on his deathbed.
And they didn't get to see the play Hamilton either.
You know,
It's a shame.
which may have been their good fortune.
From what I understand, what hampered the development of the telegraph was the railroad. From what I understand, they used the railroad rails as a ground for the telegraph wires that went overhead. And so they got a ground that would be going across the country. They couldn't send a telegraph because it has to be a two-way loop.
Interesting.
Like when they put the new street, or they talk about putting in a walking mall on State Street. Edison didn't like that at all, because all those buildings used the streetcar tracks as building grounds, and if they did that, they'd have to tear all those tracks up, and Edison would have to put their own ground in.
It's true. Yeah.
It's interesting. I always like to point out Jefferson's birthday, because all the other news of those I call it 4 days in April, all of the other events are tragedies. The beginning of the Civil War, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He's shot on the 14th, dies on the 5th, and then the sinking of the Titanic. You have all these calamities that take place in that 4-day period. The only bright spot is the birthday of Thomas Jefferson. It's the only good news out of those 4 days that in April, which have such an impact on history, our history and British history as well.
Speaking of that, from what I understand, I talk to kids that are pretty old, and they have absolutely no clue about history.
This is very true.
That's
That
right,
doesn't
that's
surprise
true.
me in the least.
They were talking to a little girl, and they were asking her a bunch of questions, and she says, how come the Americans started the war? And how come we killed all those nice people in Japan?
Yeah, there are kids that think we started World War II by
sure
the way we started it was by dropping the atom bomb on
Right,
Hiroshima.
yeah,
That's what
that-
started the
yeah.
war.
That's right.
It's the way they're taught. I mean, they're taught by unfortunately
Historical.
teachers that have an axe to grind, teachers that don't like American history.
Some teachers don't know any better, too.
And almost as bad as the ignorance
Shame.
of a lot of history is the ignorance of a lot of geography.
Oh God!
That's
Yeah.
another topic we'll get me started
Right.
on.
But the thing about history, and to a certain extent geography, if you miss one generation, it's gone
That's right.
forever.
Yeah.
Well,
There was a time when kids were taught to admire American history. They were taught that this was the
Right.
greatest nation in the world, and we should be proud to be Americans. But unfortunately, the people who write our textbooks And I think some of those who teach it have a completely different view of America. They don't like America. They don't like our history, and they
Right.
use the argument, well, we didn't tell the negative things in the past. Now all they teach is the negative. All they and much of that negative is invented. The
And
negative
that's-
is in their
and
mind.
That's what they're teaching. Besides
Yeah.
writing the
Has to be a
books,
balance.
that's what they're teaching.
They're teaching
because they.
history as they think it should be.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, a lot of texts I was using years ago ignored the black experience, the Native American experience.
Right.
But there's a question of restoring balance, not just
Right.
And
Well,
now they're
compensate-
now
overcompensate.
they're ignoring everyone else.
Well,
Now,
that's
now,
right.
now they're teaching only
Yeah.
those groups that they feel are worthy of acknowledgement.
there has to
And
be a
the
balance.
great sweep of American history, well, they're just all slaveholders and racists. Well, that's if all you know about George Washington was that he owned slaves, then you know
Or Jefferson, as you
yeah,
said.
yeah, you know very, 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 very little
Mm-hmm.
about George Washington or Thomas Jefferson.
And probably the only reason John Adams didn't own slaves was it wasn't very doable in New England.
Well, they
Sexual
had
conduct.
slavery at one time. It was
At one time,
abolished. It was
sure, yeah.
abolished in Massachusetts, but they had it in the
Did
north.
they bring the slaves in their home port, or where they were dropped off was like Boston or someplace in Massachusetts?
Well, that was
Early
of course,
on,
that was
yeah.
always the South's argument that the
Yeah.
East side.
Northerners were handling the shipping. They were making money off the shipping
Right.
of the slaves at the same time they were condemning the South for having slaves.
Right.
That was one of the arguments that Southerners used against the abolitionists, that they were hypocrites. You get that in the musical 1776.
Right.
Where the South Carolina Randolph's, I think it's Edmund Randolph. He says, "I detect a note of hypocrisy coming from the North," and there's an element of truth in that.
That's right.
Of course, the slave trade was abolished long before the Civil
Yes,
War.
yeah,
This,
yeah.
In mind, too. It crossed my mind, too, that before we were talking about the Titanic and tragedies of American history, to a certain degree, the Titanic and the sinking of the Eastland are related, because I think there was a mandate with the lifeboats that the Eastland had to add a certain number of lifeboats, and this, I think, contributed to its being weighted down and imbalanced.
Because it hadn't been designed for
Right,
those
Right.
lifeboats.
It said,
and now
well,
they put
I
all
got to
this
put
extra weight.
several hundred lifeboats. Yeah.
And there was
Yeah.
something
There's that
about
connection.
they had to strengthen a deck, and they covered it with concrete, and it raised
And it made it just too
Yes,
heavy.
Yeah.
it raised the center of gravity.
Yeah,
And
top heavy.
That's
Right.
what I'm
Right.
about,
Well,
yeah.
and of course it's the timing. The Titanic is April of 1912. The Lusitania is May of 1915, and the Eastland is, I think, July of 1915. So you had these three maritime tragedies, which with huge loss of life coming in the space of just 3 years.
That's right.
It's quite a, and there's no comparable. There's no other time in history where you find three major ship disasters like that,
Right.
also close together.
Well, look at what we have now with this Boeing. What is it?
737.
737
Max.
MP or
Yeah.
whatever it is, and that, until they find out what the problem is, and it looks like they do know, but now it's the idea of
I just reading. Remember, Nikki Haley was the ambassador to the United Nations.
sure.
She's
Yeah.
on the board of directors of Boeing now. How
Right.
that ended up, I don't
Well, that's
know.
interesting.
it's not who you.
It's not what you know; it's who you know.
Yep.
The question is, how much training, how much flying time did the pilots and co-pilots have in these disasters? That's part of your ability to deal with a plane as well.
I
I've
understand.
heard that they weren't.
They were only, 200 hours?
They had, which is not considered to be
No.
extensive enough to fly an airliner of
Right.
that
And
size.
in the U.S., I think it's 12 or 15. But I was reading something where they took off, and this stall indicator started buzzing. So they turned it off, and everything was fine. And then they turned it on, and I don't know if it was in their instructions or something, but the guy from Boeing, and he's got a vested interest in it, he says, when you turn that off, you don't turn it back on again until you're back on the ground. So I don't know if there's
Yeah.
any.
We better investigate.
You have
all
to
this.
take all that
Sounds
stuff
like an education
instead of
thing.
a grain of salt. Sometimes you got to take it with a pound of salt.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very competitive business. The Europeans are trying to sell the Airbus
Right.
And the 737 is, I believe, one of the competitors of the Airbus. So there's a political aspect to this as well. I don't mean Republican Democrat politics, but international politics. You know?
Right.
So
And there was a connection between what's his name? That flew across the ocean.
Lindbergh,
Lindbergh. His airplane was built by a company called Ryan Aircraft
Ryanair, yeah.
in
St.
that-
Louis.
St. Louis.
Spirit of St. Louis.
And that was now, it was bought by what is now Boeing.
Okay.
But it was he was a pretty good engineer. He hit these big wings on it in the gas tank in the front. And he says, you need a bigger tail for better handling. He says, no. I said, it wants to make it hard to handle so I don't fall asleep.
Yeah.
How different flying was in those days. Incredible.
Oh, boy.
But you didn't have the responsibility of hundreds of passengers either.
The Ford Trimotor, where you had one of the engines was in the fuselage itself, and
Right.
that's when they apparently realized that was not a good idea because it just caused so much vibration.
Right.
That's why all subsequent airliners had all the engines were out on the wings, where
Right.
it doesn't
Well,
contribute to the.
Stout Metal Aircraft Company was the company that Henry Ford bought. And he built what is now the Dearborn Proving Grounds, which was the Ford Airport. And they were Wright Whirlwind circular engines. And I think he did put the third engine out for as much as PR as he did, because he figured if they seen three engines are better than two.
Well, yeah, that was the idea. Sure. Oh, yeah.
Right.
That was because these things were not. They didn't know how dependable aircraft engines were.
Right.
One of them goes out, you've still got two more to depend on. That was
Right.
Sure. That was one of the selling points on it. Having all
Right.
those
And
engines.
they were only made, I think, 2.5 years at the most in Dearborn.
Yeah, but it's one of the. It's an overused word. They say iconic. I mean, it was
Right.
the airliner before the DC-3.
Right.
It's the airliner that everybody
then-
remembers before the
then,
DC-3.
Was it Boeing? They had another one that kind of went along with their kind of not a predecessor, but a thing like the Trimotor, and I can't remember what they called it. But they had a company called Transcontinental Air Transport. He sold a lot of them too, and that's still around today. Only it's called TWA, Teeny Weeny Airlines.
I know what you're saying about the three, and I can't think of the name of it either.
They had a one to compete with the DC-3 too,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, Boeing had because that's Douglas. You know, the DC-3 was made by Douglas.
right?
And of course, at that time, you had all these. You had Lockheed, you had
Lockheed Martin.
North American, and you had a
Right.
number of in the late 30s.
About when was
40s.
Boeing established, do we know?
In the 30s.
In the 30s,
It
that
was
far
in the
back.
19 It was in the 1930s.
Okay.
Yeah.
And it was
A man named
Seattle,
Boeing was it?
right?
Yeah.
Was it?
Oh
Now,
yeah.
is Boeing building the same one it was with the Morton Salt Company? Was that where they used to be? Because Morton Salt had, it was called Morton Thiokol, and they made the seals for the.
Where are you talking
for
about?
the-
In Chicago? you
Wacker
mean?
Drive, maybe.
Well, I don't know. That
Oh, I don't know about Wacker, but
But they had one. It said Morton Salt on it, and there was another company called Morton Thiokol, and they made the seals for the engines on the space shuttle that blew up.
Oh.
That's interesting.
I don't know.
And then Boeing was in Seattle based, from what I understand, and now they're based in Chicago. I'm just wondering if they were in the old Morton Salt building.
Can't help you with that one. I don't know. Well, we sort of plumbed the depths, I think, as regarding the Titanic. It's a great tragedy.
Plumb the depths.
Yeah, it's.
What do you
quite a
guys think
phrase.
of the election here in Chicago?
I don't
That's a
even.
topic.
As
I
little
don't-
as possible.
Yeah, I didn't pay in this Lightfoot. Yeah, I didn't know she was married to a lesbian.
No, that's
Yeah.
another topic.
Well, I never knew it because
Yeah.
I never followed anything
Yeah.
like that.
It was Well, everybody
It's legal
knew
now.
about it when they were on TV.
No.
And
I'm not saying there's anything wrong. Well, there is something wrong, but
she's
that's their
much-
business.
She's white and she's got to be 3 foot taller than Lightfoot.
That's true.
It looks like anyway.
It's just interesting, though, that there was a time when the final election in Chicago was between a Republican and a Democrat, the way most elections in the country are.
Right.
Right.
But they did, and of course, Mayor Daley, every time he ran, he always had a Republican opponent whom he trounced. Although of course, the son of
Adamowski a little bit different.
Adamowski was a closer race. Yeah, Adamowski. In fact, that actually scared the mayor. They say in 1963, he didn't come close to defeating him, but he became closer than was comfortable for the Democratic organization. But then in subsequent years, they did away with that and went to this open primary system, so that essentially, it's the primary within the Democratic Party, and you wind up with two Democrats running against each other. I don't know how much of a Republican vote is left in the city of Chicago. I haven't looked at the numbers. I'm sure it's not substantial, but I remember reading that when the first Mayor Daley became mayor in 1953, there were, I think, 17 Republican aldermen in the Chicago City Council.
Yeah, many.
17 out of
Interesting.
50. Now, when you look at that, which meant that there was a significant Republican constituency in
Right.
Chicago in the 50s, and Adamowski coming, close. And you look at it today, where the Republican Party is non-existent. There hasn't been a
Right.
single Republican alderman in decades in the Chicago City Council, and now you have a mayoral election in which you have two Democrats. So,
And there's a lot more shakeup in the council.
oh
itself.
yeah,
Yeah.
tremendous turnover.
You got 5 or 6 aldermen who are claiming to be socialists. That's going to be interesting to see where they go.
And
They're
as-
not even through
it's-
counting the
There's
votes.
still 2.
Today
that are still-
they should be
In
done.
this day and time, socialist is, in my opinion, too nice of a word. It's more or less like
Communism,
Marxist.
Marxism.
Well, the president says this will never be a socialist nation, and there was a man named Norman Thomas who was he was the socialist candidate for president time in the 40s and 50s, probably even into the 1930s. Norman Thomas was an American socialist, and somebody said to him once, "Well, didn't President Roosevelt really carry out the socialist platform?" And Thomas said, "Yeah, he carried it out all right. He carried it out on a stretcher." So he did not feel that Roosevelt had done any favors to the Socialist Party. Contrary what some people accuse Roosevelt of being a socialist. Norman Thomas didn't think that Roosevelt was a socialist.
Sure. Ask
But-
Colonel McCormick what he thought of Roosevelt.
No, that was McCormick. We were, we had talked about one of the topics we were going to talk about this month. We'll probably push it off now into next month. Would be radio. We're going to talk about radio in the Chicago area. When I had talked to our impresario and our producer John DeVita, we had talked about that. But this being the anniversary of the Titanic, it seemed to be more appropriate to spend some time on that.
A little bit of radio in
And
there
some of
too.
and we're on the radio. But I had heard WLS celebrated their 95th anniversary this past week,
Right.
and they had a retrospective from 5 to 7 Friday night, which I could not listen to because I had commitments Friday night. But apparently they were going to do 2 hours of clips and
Right.
memories of radio, and of course. WLS has a long history in the city of Chicago,
That's
and
right.
they even in the promos for it, they said, this is the radio broadcasting from from the world's largest store,
right.
which of course is what WLS
Right.
represents.
That's
And their
World's
first
largest
studio was
store.
in the first Sears Tower, which is still there at Holman and Arlington.
Oh, okay, sure.
And as a matter of fact, if you're going down to Eisenhower or on your Holman Avenue, you look over to the south, and you can see it. If you have to look for it, but it's sort of
like-
prominent.
Just like keeping the Western Electric Tower, but only the tower
Yeah,
in this whole
yeah.
complex.
I thought they had that whole front facade along.
No, it's just that's all gone.
That's all
Oh,
gone.
that's all gone. It's a
Now, isn't that a shopping
it's a
center?
shopping complex.
Okay.
Yeah. No,
Right.
the old, if you remember the old Western Electric Tower that stood at the corner of Cicero Avenue and Cermak Road, it was not a separate tower. It was connected to the rest of the building. It was just additional floors with a peak on the existing building.
Remember when you
Because
talking?
I asked about, when the building was coming down, we talked about the historical, keeping it as a landmark, and we were told it wouldn't be impossible. It wouldn't be structurally viable. If you tore the wings down, it wouldn't stand. Because
So
it
you
was-
have to leave a couple 40 or
they-
50
and-
feet on
and
either
they,
side.
They weren't going to. They were obviously
Right.
they didn't intend to do that. But they had this other tower, which is a separate freestanding tower that's
Right.
deeper into the property, which is still there.
Right.
Which is still there, and it looks like the tower of a castle. It's a separate tower. It was where their police force and their fire department.
Right.
Because Western Electric had their own fire service,
I
their
know.
own police service, their own There was a medical contingent, a medical center, which I think was in that building as well. I
They
can't
had their
sort of
own
that.
railroad too.
And the MJ Railroad, the Manufacturers
Junction.
Junction Railroad, which I went.
It was on 26th Street.
I
They
not
shuffled cars around.
I not only rode it, I actually once ran the engine for a few moments. The
Right.
engineer let me take the throttle, and I ran the engine for a while.
It had
on
a
the old-
Plymouth
and
engine with a cab in the middle. Steeple cab, they called it.
I have a patch. They gave me a patch, the MJ Railroad, their insignia patch,
Right.
which I still have. But yeah, the
remember
Manufacturers
that.
Junction Railway. So yeah, that Western Electric was a gigantic complex. It employed, they say during the war, it reached 50,000 people working at Western Electric during World War II.
Right.
In the 70s, they still had over 20,000 people working in the 70s.
At our church, there was two brothers. That's the only place they worked.
Oh, sure.
And there was two sisters. That's the only place they worked.
Oh, it went in.
And they were
Sure.
It was
fabulously
not uncommon
wealthy.
in the old days.
In Cicero, any
Yeah,
number
yeah.
of people you talk to, they worked, they got their start, they worked at Western Electric, or they spent their whole career at Western Electric,
Right.
or they got their start there and went on. Well, young lady who was our town clerk for a number of years, her first job was at Western Electric.
I think I remember who you're talking about.
Her name was Marilyn.
She used to be in the. She was the first lady you saw when you walked into.
in the clerk's office. Yeah,
Right.
she was great, a very, very fine young lady, Marilyn Colpo. She was she got her start. I remember her telling me her first job was at Western Electric.
She was a nice lady. She had a unique way of dressing, but she was a nice lady.
Oh, she dressed well. Marilyn was always
I'm
well.
thinking about
You're
something.
thinking of, you're thinking of complete. You're thinking of, we had a lady that was a receptionist. That's not Marilyn. Marilyn was in the clerk's office.
Okay.
No, Marilyn always.
The receptionist was the first lady you saw when you walked in. Yeah,
that was
You-
Blanche.
you-
I know that lady. She was.
What was her unique way of dressing?
I'll tell you off the air.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, we got an
So,
implication there.
but Western was talk about a landmark. I mean, it was the industrial behemoth of the
Right.
West, and it straddled Cicero and Chicago. Part of it was in
Right, going
Chicago.
across the
Yeah.
tracks.
And that was back in the days when Cicero was the second largest industrial community, production community in the state of Illinois.
Wow.
Chicago was first with a population of 3.5 million
That's
people.
interesting.
And Cicero, with a population of 70,000, was the second largest manufacturing center in the state of Illinois.
At one time, they did have 70,000 people in Cicero.
Population, oh
Wow,
yeah.
okay.
Oh yeah, it's still ill. Our population
Oak
today
Park
is over
had it 54,000. Now I think they're going down.
Cicero is back. I think the population in Cicero is 70 or 80,000 now.
Wow.
It's up again, but Cicero was that was kind of the unique thing about Cicero. It had industry, commerce, residence.
Now for another brief intermission. We'll be back soon.
Hello, friends. Do you need new tires for your vehicle? How are the brakes? Are they in good condition? How's your front wheel alignment? Do you need your tires rotated? How are the shocks and struts? Do you need an oil and grease change? How about a tune-up? When was the last time you had your engine tuned up? How about the wiper blades? Are they nice, sharp blades to clean off the rain and snow? How are the headlights? tail lights, stop lights, turn directional signals. Are all the bulbs working? How's your cooling system and the exhaust system? How about your battery? Does that need to be upgraded? How about the belts and hoses, fuel injectors, timing belt and chain, and the air conditioning? Is that all working properly? Well, if you need any maintenance work done on your vehicle, go to Grand Tire and Auto Service, which is located at 7034 West Grand Avenue in Chicago. They are on Grand Avenue on the north side of the street, about 2 blocks east of Harlem Avenue. You can't miss the building. There's a big Goodyear sign right on top of the building. Or you can call area code 773-622-4361. Don, Chris, or Ken will be more than happy to assist you and to help you with any questions you might have about the maintenance on your vehicle. Their hours are Monday through Friday, 7:30 to 7 o'clock in the evening. Saturday, from 7:30 in the morning until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And even on Sunday, from 9:30 in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So once again, for any maintenance work you might need on your vehicle, go to Grand Tire and Auto Supply. Once again, their address is at 7034 West Grand Avenue in Chicago, about 2 blocks east of Harlem Avenue on the north side of the street. And their phone number is area code 773-622-4361. They have great service. Their mechanics are all certified mechanics, and they do quality work. Now, I've been going to Grand Tire with my vehicle since 1985, right up until this present day. So once again, Grand Tire and Auto Service at 7034 West Grand Avenue in Chicago. Their phone number is 773-622-4361. Don, Chris, and Ken will be more than happy to help you and to advise you on any maintenance work you might need on your vehicle. So once again, Grand Tire and Auto Service at 7034 Grand Avenue in Chicago, about 2 blocks east of Harlem Avenue on the north side of the street. You can't miss the building because there's a big Goodyear sign on the top of the building. That's Grand Tire and Auto Service, 7034 Grand Avenue in Chicago, and their phone number is area code 773-622-4361. For quality service, it's Grand Tire Auto Service, 7034 Grand Avenue in Chicago, 773-622-4361.
Now, back to our discussion. John?
Thank you very much, Rich Lang. Let's go around the table again and give everybody an opportunity to introduce themselves, and I'll start with our announcer.
Okay. This is your announcer, Rich Lang. I've had a background in history, modern American and European, and now more and more it's local Chicago history.
Okay, and our I always say our longest-serving member of our panel.
And I'm Bill Kugelman. I was fourth generation on the Chicago Fire Department, and also past president of the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago, of which we will have an open house at 5218 Southwestern. Let's see, I'm looking at it'll be April 27th from 10 until 2. And we have done one of our programs from there at
Yes,
one
we did.
time.
Right.
But it's really changed now. And our good friend Ken Little, we have named the second floor as the Ken Little Library.
Right.
And we have a lot of his memorabilia that Ken was quite a collector over the years,
Right.
and that's all on the second floor. But we do have it's all open on the first floor with the
Right.
history of the Chicago Fire Department
Right.
and the history of Our Lady of the Angels tragic fire in 1958. We have quite a setup for that.
Right.
We also have the last remaining statue of Christopher Columbus, and that was at the 1893 Columbian Exposition.
Right.
That's hard to say.
Right.
And this was, of course, everything burned around there,
Right.
and this was left, and it was left to the Chicago Fire Department. We now, the Fire Museum, have it
Right.
on display, and I hate to say it, but they're not going to get their hands on it. Every Italian organization in the city of Chicago and state wants that
Right.
statue, and they're not going to get it.
And a little history.
Possession is 9/10 of
Right.
the law.
Exactly,
A
exactly.
little history of that. It was outside of a building that made ice,
Yes,
and they had a fire in there, and these guys went up a wall or up a tower. And the fire got between them and the bottom, and they either burned or people jumped off, and that's why they put Columbus as a monument or a memory or something like that. And for a long time, it was on the south side, and then it ended up in the shops on the second floor, and then the fire museum got it.
right.
But
Right. Yes, and if we didn't get some of that stuff, it was thrown in dumpsters.
that's right.
And there's a lot of history that ended up in those dumpsters, and
Yes.
it's a
For sure.
That's a lot of
really
history.
damn shame that
A lot of
was
history. If somebody dies and doesn't leave it to somebody who knows what it is,
Exactly.
it's junk. Goes right
That's
in
why
the dumpster.
our motto, at least
Don't-
my motto, was don't throw it out. We'll
They-
take it.
With
They
a-
had a documentary Saturday evening about Joseph Pulitzer on Channel 11, the famous publisher for whom the Pulitzer Prizes are named, and he was the publisher of the New York World, and before that the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which
is still in
which is
business.
still in business. The New York World merged; it became the World Telegram and the Sun in the 40s and 50s. Then it merged into what was called the World Journal Tribune in the 60s, and that went out of business. But in any event, when the World had a huge building, they showed the building that was the publishing. He wanted the biggest newspaper building in New York, it had a dome. And when that was vacated, when the World was no longer a separate paper, it was about to be demolished, and they claimed that someone had the foresight to take the newspapers. They had copies of all the papers in volumes. They had these
Right.
huge volumes, and they did save that. But all the archives, all the records, everything else was just carted away to the dumpsters and burned. It was taken to the incinerators and destroyed because no one gave a thought that anyone might want this for historical
That's right.
purpose. I'm just thinking that when you're talking about how all this stuff was just destroyed.
Well, my grandson, the oldest grandson, who works for CBS, just moved from New York to Los Angeles, across the country, and he came in the other day. He spent, he spent a week with us, and then flew back to California. But I said, well, Matt, what's to do? How do you like it? He says, hey, Papa, he says, I wish I was back in New York. There's history. There's nothing like it out in California.
That's right.
And he went to USC, sent him to USC. So he's got some friends out there, but he says,
Right.
you know what?
Palm Creek.
Not like New York.
Well,
He says, I may even buy a car. He said, and go back to New York? Are you crazy?
right.
There's a movie. Of course, Frank Sinatra is the typical New Yorker, although he was born in New Jersey. But you think of Sinatra as a New Yorker, and there's one of his movies where they're talking about Florida, and Sinatra says, "Yeah, Florida, great state if you're an orange."
Sounds like
Right. But Los Angeles, 50 years is history back then.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
All your
But
pictures.
not like New York. You
No.
know, it's
But how much longer are we going to see newspapers in print?
Well, they made
Yeah,
some
this-
reference to
we-
that. I
we-
mean, they
just-
talked
this
about
is-
how important newspapers were in the 1880s. That everybody read a newspaper.
Sure, several.
And commute, more than one. And you would ride, you'd commute.
Yeah.
This was the age when commuting had begun with subways and the surface trains. You had nothing else to do, so you read a newspaper. That was the obvious thing to do, was to
yeah.
buy a paper and read the paper while you're riding to work. And
There
then
you go.
coming back, you'd get an evening paper, and you'd read the evening paper as you were going home.
but now this is 2019.
Yeah.
Now what do we have? We have this little, what is it? 1.5
Tabloid.
by maybe 4 inches, and you just look at all of your history and
Right.
your papers on here, and
Yeah.
that's all people do. They don't talk to each other anymore.
Yeah. One
No.
time the Tribune published, 4 or 5 issues a day?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
And then
Many
extras.
editions,
And then,
yeah.
of course, the
Yeah.
famous extra. You open
Right.
the old extra, read all about it.
And then the American, the Herald American, and
Yeah.
The
s-
news,
the Sometimes.
Daily News.
Some-
Daily News, yeah.
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 I've got the last issue of the Daily News. It was
Chicago.
published on a Saturday. It says,
Yeah.
"Good, so long," or
Yeah.
"Goodbye, Chicago."
Is it still holding up? I mean, it's not drying
it's,
out.
It's drying
turning
out,
up.
yeah.
Well,
but
that's a problem.
I never would see the Daily News until my aunt and uncle would come to visit us. Sometimes they would spend the weekend with us. And my uncle would go out on Saturday afternoon and get the Sunday papers, which
Right.
and the Daily News, which in our family, no one read the Daily News. I had maybe had heard of it, but I'd never seen a copy of the Daily News.
That was a tabloid.
No,
No,
Daily
it
News
wasn't.
was a broadsheet. No,
Oh,
it was
yeah,
a
oh,
full
yeah.
size
It doesn't
paper.
have a
paper.
liberal or leftist reputation that much.
No, it's just that nobody in my family. My family took the Tribune,
No.
and my grandmother took the American.
That was the evening paper. Or
and
afternoon
I
paper.
knew of the Sun Times, and I think my grandmother took the Sun Times also. But I had never seen a copy of the Daily News. I mean, I just, my dad didn't commute. It was an evening paper. My dad, he had his own business, so he didn't commute. So nobody was bringing the Daily News home in the evening. So I used to, and what was fascinating for me, I'd get to see all these comics when
Right.
that I otherwise
Comics.
wouldn't get to see because my uncle would go out, and they had all these, the Sunday color comics in the Daily News that I wouldn't have seen before. So, and I remember the sports columnist. My uncle was a friend of the big Daily News sports columnist whose picture he's got his picture in my mind.
Kilpatrick?
No, he white-haired gentleman, and he was the. I'll think of it for the next program. But my uncle knew it. My uncle knew Jack Brickhouse and many of these well-known figures. But I remember reading his column, sports column. One of these, the traditional old-fashioned sports columns of the 50s and 60s. You see in
Right.
the movies about. I don't know if that type of column still exists anymore.
I think it doesn't. This,
Not much so. The
No.
Tribune's
The
got
Sun-Times-
like a big page,
well, they've
of
got
it.
4 or 5 pages at the end of the
and the
Sun-Times.
Sun-Times has got 4 or 5
Rick
pages.
Hollander.
yeah.
I mean, they have columns that have
Right.
been
Yeah.
around a while, yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I mean, that was, and I then when I started commuting, when I would go downtown to college, I was a big deal. I would pick up the Daily News. I thought, gee, I'm getting this evening paper that I never. And it wasn't too long after that they went out of business because they went.
That was a good paper too.
Yeah.
That was a nice
Yeah.
paper.
Yeah, it was a good.
And I still do what you said there. I buy the Trib on Saturday, sometime on Saturday, and then I'll buy the Sun-Times on Sunday to catch up
Yeah.
with what
Shaker's
they
got
have.
an
My family always
advertising
bought the
company.
The
Tribune.
Daily News
Yeah.
had Mike Royko
And
for a while.
They would
Yeah.
get the
Yeah.
Sunday papers at 8 o'clock on
He
Saturday
started with the
morning.
Daily News.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Cross
my
the
boss
big
says, "What the heck you
papers.
doing?" I said, "I'm reading the funny papers."
Oh, that's Duncan Ronaldo. We're looking at Duncan Ronaldo's hardware, his firearms, his holster, and bullets.
Cisco Kid.
If the television 1950s Cisco Kid, hey Cisco, hey Pancho, and
The
one
bullets in that.
of the great cowboy heroes.
in that.
Which is Quick Draw McGraw,
What?
That was
Well,
a cartoon.
right?
the
Hey, Quick Straw,
the
Baba Louie.
Baba Louie.
Baba Louie.
the bullets in this of his leather holsters here. These bullets were not regular bullets. They were shot
Shotgun,
shells.
yeah.
And so that when these are the guns that he used when he would ride into a rodeo or that, and they'd have either plates or balloons or something.
He wouldn't have to get too close.
And then he couldn't miss
That's what I
because it
mean.
was like shooting it with a shotgun.
Yeah.
Well, when I got these, and that's a long story. When I got these, all of these bullets evidently disappeared. My son loved to do that and show off to his
So he used up all the.
friends. And there's no way that I can prove that this was Cisco's gun holster set here. But if you watch his movies
You'll see the.
of that, you'll see him with these guns on. Yeah,
Another
I've
question
often
comes to
wondered
mind
what
is
they're
the sign
worth.
of the times. Can one buy a cap pistol anymore? I don't think
You
so.
don't see them in stores. You don't see. I don't see any type of toy guns anymore.
Because they were metal, you don't see any toy guns
No,
anymore.
but I mean,
cheapy plastic job.
it's political. It's
Yeah.
where you're not supposed to encourage firearms. You're not supposed to
Right.
encourage.
I don't know
And
if
I
they
think
even
some
make
of them are
caps.
painted orange now, actually.
When I was a kid, I mean, you were always playing. You were either playing cowboy or playing soldier.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
It was always guns, and now that's frowned upon
It's
now by
not
the
politically
Smell
correct.
of shooting off caps. I remember that so
Right.
well. Nobody does.
I don't think they even make caps.
We used to get a
anymore.
whole roll of caps, and drop with a brick.
Well, it's time the fireworks of the 4th of July.
The yellow
Oh.
guns
The 4th of
were
July.
made for a reason, and that's so that a police law enforcement would see that they were yellow
Right.
and that. But
That's a
there was no law, for that.
Right.
So it kind of disappeared.
Well, there are kids that have been disciplined and threatened with expulsion for making their finger and their
Right.
index look like
Making
a
a sound.
pistol.
Oh,
They're
yeah.
saying that's threatening. Oh yeah, there have been instances
Yeah.
of teachers that have severely disciplined a kid for doing what routinely we did when I was a kid was going bang bang with your fingers simulating a gun.
We have people on our block that got in trouble because they didn't walk their kid to school, which was a half a block away. That would be child endangerment.
Yeah, yeah. And what did we do when we were kids in the empty lots? You don't hear that anymore. Anyway, empty lots. You played cowboys and Indians.
When I was 10 years old, I would walk from East Avenue to Austin Boulevard, get on, I don't know if it was a bus or a streetcar, went to Pulaski and there was a Goldblatt's there, pick up stuff for my mom, come back and walk home. And I was 10 years old. They wouldn't let you go 2 blocks now by yourself.
Where did we ever get the idea that you're not free to do something because it offends somebody else? There's nothing dangerous, absolutely no danger from somebody making their finger and their thumb simulate a pistol. You're not going to wound anybody or kill anybody with your finger. But where did anyone derive the idea that you can forbid someone to do something because it offends somebody else?
Wouldn't you think
Well,
that would be the
that's
First
a
Amendment?
violation of the First
I would
Amendment.
Think so.
Yeah.
I would think
Yeah.
so. A kid has some rights as well too.
Right.
Because almost anything you would do is probably going to
It's going to
offend
offend-
somebody somewhere.
And the
Yeah.
person who's
Yeah.
offended says
Yeah.
things and does things that I might find to be
But
offensive.
I know better than you do, so
That's
I
the
can
whole
do
idea.
whatever I
That's
want to
the-
do.
That's the idea, is that
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
we know better.
That's
We
right.
know what is offensive and what
Right.
is.
So don't offend us by trying to tell us we're wrong.
I came across a great quotation from Winston Churchill when he said, "Freedom of speech is widely honored, but unfortunately, some people think that freedom of speech means they are free to say whatever they want.
Right.
But if someone says anything back, that's an outrage."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's crystal clear the way things are today.
Right.
One group thinks that it has the monopoly on freedom of speech. And we're getting our little we just had a little fireworks display of our own here. We had a little light. We're rehearsing
That's
for
nice
the
and pretty.
we're rehearsing for the 4th of July when we hope there will not be 2 inches of snow on the ground. And we will be looking at this magnificent lights display. We've got a laser light display here in our.
Laser.
We warn you, don't try to find the John DeVita Broadcast Center. It is a highly secret, highly secured location. You have to go through too many checkpoints. They've got these retina scans, fingerprints.
And if you happen to find it, you'll fall into it.
Only a handful of people know where it is.
Yeah, only a very small select few. So
select group.
Don't try to find us. You would be well advised, just to listen to our radio show and let it go.
But I can be bought. Talk about 4th of July. There's more fireworks. I live.
Oh yeah.
In the Burrow and Cicero Oak Park in Chicago, that little corner.
When we did our second, I didn't give you an opportunity, I think, but if you want to once again introduce yourself and let us know who you are. And
I'm still Don Peter. I live in Oak Park, and I still volunteer at the Fire Museum of Greater Chicago.
Yeah.
Very good.
At least for now.
You know how to get to the studios. Right.
We've only got and it's hard to find. I mean, they take down many of the signs have been taken down. The signs point in the wrong direction. It's like in World War II when they were trying to misdirect the troops at Normandy.
They take down the street signs and the house numbers.
So you can't find the location. I mean, it is really, the security around here is just unbelievable, folks.
That's right.
John DeVita is one of the most highly secured broadcasters in American broadcasting.
And I told some people about that and says that's unbelievable.
We're coming up. We've just got a few minutes left. We hope you've enjoyed. We had not planned this, but our producer John DeVita and Bill Kugelman had mentioned that this is the anniversary of the Titanic. It's kind of it's a hobby of mine. I've been fascinated by the Titanic since the first time I saw that film with Barbara Stanwyck when they used to run it on Saturday night at the movies when I was a kid. It's a fascinating story. And they do the story in that film about the Strausses and Mr. and Mrs. Strauss. It's just a tremendous thing. So I hope you've enjoyed it.
It's a shame that I wish Jim Gibbons would have been here because he at 1:00 had a session. He's our that's his business as historian, and that was his subject for today to give to these people was the Titanic.
I did. In 2012, I was fortunate. I did a number of presentations. I call my talk "A Night Still Remembered," playing on the "A Night to Remember" from the famous book.
There you go. Yeah.
But so we'll probably next month, if not next month. In the coming months, we will be talking about Chicago radio broadcasting. There's much I think probably we could discuss about the various stations, their call letters, some of the famous radio programs from the days past. And we're in radio. We're going to talk about baseball.
Tell people what our next day is.
Our next show, our next broadcast, right on our stage, will be May the 20th. In the year of our Lord 2019, that will be the third Monday in May. We're kind of early, this April began on a Monday, so we're here early. The 15th is about as it is as early as we can do our third Monday of the month. So next month we will be here on the 20th of May. We may be talking about radio. We may be talking about baseball. We may be talking about veterans because that will be Memorial Day month, the month in which we observe Memorial Day. So we'll have a lot to talk about. I'm looking at a picture of our good friend Ken Little. We remember Ken Little very well, an eminent historian. We wish Jack Ryan, of course, good health and hope he'll be back with us soon. And we hope that you're going to have a very blessed and a very happy Easter this coming Sunday.
Yes, happy Easter to all.
And if you have a
wrong holiday.
If you have a chance, watch Easter Parade. It's a great old MGM musical with Fred Astaire and Judy Garland. It's one of the finest films of that type ever made. Peter Lawford and Ann Miller, great dancer, Ann Miller. And it's if not Judy's last great film, it's getting close because she. After this was made in 1948, she made a movie called In the Good Old Summertime with Van Johnson in '49, and her last MGM film was called Summer Stock in 1950 with Gene Kelly. But Easter Parade's a terrific film, and Fred Astaire came out of retirement to do the movie. It was supposed to be Gene Kelly, but he broke his ankle just before filming was about to start. He slipped in joining the swimming pool at his property in California, and Fred Astaire came out of retirement, and as a result, Fred Astaire went on to another 20 years of movie making. So it was really fortuitous, and Fred Astaire is great in the picture. Easter Parade with all of the great Irving Berlin music, and there was a time when CBS would run that every year on the Saturday before Easter, on Holy Saturday, and I don't think it's not on broadcast TV anymore, but
Probably on one of the cable ones.
Find a DVD or on cable, or find a VHS, or find a
Beautiful Technicolor, too.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Oh,
yeah.
beautiful.
a fellow named Arthur Freed who did all the great musicals for. And then there's all the biblical movies. I always love the biblical films at Easter time. You've got The Robe with Richard Burton about the crucifixion of Christ. And then the follow-on was called Demetrius and the Gladiators with Victor Mature and Susan Hayward. And there is The Greatest Story Ever Told, The Life of Christ.
Right.
Telly Savalas plays Pontius Pilate in The Greatest Story Ever Told. There is the Ten Commandments will be on this coming Saturday. I'm sure every year ABC runs the
big one.
Ten Commandments,
Right.
starring Charlton Heston as Moses parting the Red Sea. So that'll be on usually at 6 o'clock Chicago time, Central Time, on Holy Saturday. So there are many great biblical films about the life of Christ and about the Bible, and it's I think it's good to see these things at
Well,
every Easter time.
I think that yes, the younger generation should watch this because a lot of them don't know anything about it.
And there was a time
they
when
just don't know.
broadcast channels would run religious programming at Easter, and you see very little of that anymore. Very little religious programming because they're downplaying religion.
By the way, our next meeting, like you say, John, is May 20th, and I just see here that in Canada that's Victoria Day.
Ah,
For any of you Canadians out there.
Canadians.
Queen Victoria, Her Majesty the Queen.
That be her birth date? I imagine so.
They just celebrated it as Victoria Day, so they must have thought a lot of her.
I think it might be near or close to her actual birthday. That's possible. That's possible.
Well,
Yeah.
this Elizabeth, she doesn't.
Longest
she doesn't-
serving
she,
monarch.
She observes her birthday like 2 months before it is.
Or her real birthday is a week from. Her real birthday is Easter Sunday. Her real birthday is, I believe, the 21st. In June.
In June, right?
They have the official, because the weather is chancy
Right.
in April, so
Oh,
they
that's
have
interesting.
her official
They
birthday
do
in June.
flyovers and all this.
Flyovers. They review the troop. They have a ceremony they call Trooping the Color.
Right.
The regiments of the Household Guard
Right.
parade,
Right.
and for years she led the procession on horseback. For years she led it on horseback. Now she's in a carriage. As she got older, she now rides
Right.
in a carriage, and the rest of the royal. But they'll have the Buckingham Palace. It is a big
It's a
event.
big deal,
It'll be a big
yeah.
event. It'll be on I believe it's on a Saturday. They do it
And
on a
her
Saturday.
and her
in
husband during the
June.
war almost didn't make it because they heard airplanes coming. From what I understand, looked out the window and they were Nazi
Oh, in
planes
World War II.
coming right at them.
She is the last head of state who served in World War II.
That's right.
Right.
She was a truck and auto
Right?
mechanic.
She, in the final
a
years,
truck driver.
She was in uniform as one of the girl volunteers in uniform. So
Right.
she is still he's the only head of state or head of government who is a veteran of the Second World War. Yeah.
What's her name? Who was the one that was the counterpart to Kate Smith in the UK?
Oh, Vera Lynn.
Vera Lynn.
Vera Lynn.
I don't know. I haven't heard that she
White
passed
Cliff-
away.
I don't think she. I haven't heard.
She's
that
got to
she-
be in her
well,
hundreds.
well up in age. Oh, we got one moment. Dick Cole passed away on, I think, April the 9th. The name Dick Cole might not mean anything to you. He was a lieutenant colonel. He was the last surviving member of the Doolittle bombing raid on Japan.
That was covered.
Right.
Yeah, he was Doolittle's co-pilot.
He was the last living member of the flyers in the Army Air Forces that bombed Tokyo and other targets.
Right.
in 1942, the Doolittle raid on, and he just died. He was 103 years old.
Yeah.
When you said 100, it reminded me of that. So a gallant American airman, Dick Cole, passed from among us.
Not a great military victory. It was a great psychological one.
Great psychological. They didn't drop many bombs, but Japan believed it could not be touched, and they
were not
learned. They
invincible.
learned.
Right, and they almost didn't come up with it because supposedly a ship spotted them and radioed their whereabouts.
And it's believed that encouraged them to launch the attack on Midway in retaliation, which was the great disaster for the Japanese Navy. So it had a significant military effect to the extent that it encouraged them to launch that attack. We're coming up on our conclusion. Thank you all for being on behalf of Bill Kugelman, on behalf of Rich Lang, on behalf of Don Peters. Thank you. And of course, John DeVita, our impresario and producer. Have a very blessed and happy Easter.
Now to you.
Have a good night.
Recordings of previous Meet the Chicago Historians programs are available for your listening pleasure via the internet at www.windycityhometown.com. We want to thank the executive producer of Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network, John Seconda. On behalf of everyone associated with this historians program, we thank you for listening. And as we said, have a great Easter and best wishes to you and yours. This is your announcer, Rich Lang. So long until next time.
And a happy Passover.
Right.
That's right.
Oh, I'll tell you that the thing about
You have been listening to Meet the Chicago Historians from the John DeVita Broadcast Center on the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network on Monday, Income Tax Day, April the 15th, the year 2019. This broadcast was produced and directed by John DeVita, and once again, our special thanks to our executive producer of Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network, Mr. John Seconda. And while I happen to think about it, a very happy birthday again to John Seconda and John Shikoku. On behalf of the entire staff of the Windy City Hometown Entertainment Network, happy Easter and God bless everybody.